I never really understood the value of celebrating achievements until that fateful day in October when everything changed, and perhaps I should warn you, this isn't just a story about self-acceptance or growth. It's a tale of what happens when we overlook the little victories in our lives. You see, my name is Alex, and for years, I bottled everything up, each tiny win dismissed, each setback magnified. Life in my small suburban town felt like a monotonous grind, and I was convinced that unless I achieved something monumental, like winning a prestigious award or landing a dream job, celebrating was simply a waste of time. My friends told me I was too hard on myself, but I've never been the type to keep judgment away from my own life. I would compare myself to the perpetual overachievers, the thriving artists, the successful entrepreneurs who made their dreams come true. That tiny voice in my head told me, you're just an average nobody, so I pushed myself, harder and harder, to reach those unattainable heights. But on that particular October morning, as the dull gray clouds threatened rain, everything felt unusually heavy. I woke up to a series of unrelenting notifications on my phone. My notifications buzzed like an angry swarm of bees, declaring various milestones from acquaintances on social media, engagements, promotions, new houses, all the predictable signs of success that had me questioning my own worth. Nobody cares about your small victories, I thought, consumed by that familiar ache of resentment, which spiraled into self-pity. I pulled the covers over my head and tried to ignore the world outside my window. Hours passed, and finally, I mustered the energy to get up. I shuffled through the house, everything feeling dimmer than usual, every room a stark reminder of how far I was from happiness. And that's when it happened. I stopped in front of my bathroom mirror, fighting off the emotional weight I was bearing, staring into my own eyes, well, technically, the person I had become. A flicker of an idea crossed my mind. What if I somehow made today different? What if I forced myself to celebrate something, anything? I spent the next few moments ruminating, and I remembered back to that week I'd finally completed a small but tortuous marathon of editing my first novel. I'd been quietly optimistic about it, only to dismiss the achievement entirely once I submitted it. I didn't even allow myself to acknowledge I was finished. I had been waiting for that life-changing moment with the book deal to validate my efforts, yet here I was, alive and still hoping. Maybe that was something I could celebrate. I decided to throw caution to the wind and treat myself, so I changed into clothes not meant for hibernating, hopped in my worn-out car, and headed toward my favorite little cafe. It was nearby, a charming spot adorned with mismatched furniture and giant windows that let in warm, golden light. I walked in, the comforting smell of coffee wrapping around me like a beloved blanket. I made my way to the counter, ordered my usual caramel macchiato, and when I turned to grab a table, I noticed an unusual sight. The cafe was filled with laughter, friends, and milestones. I watched as people cheered with a burst of confetti for someone celebrating a birthday, while another table erupted with clinking glasses for a promotion. For a fleeting moment, it felt as if the universe was mocking me, flaunting all the things I thought I'd never achieve, a cruel reminder of my own insignificance. In that moment, I considered leaving, but as I turned to the door, something stopped me. What if today was about unmasking guilt and shame, instead of succumbing to them? I took a deep breath and pushed my way into the vibrant atmosphere, ordering a slice of impossibly decadent chocolate cake to go with my coffee. I plopped down at a corner table, determined to relish this tiny act of kindness towards myself. As I took a bite of the warm cake, I felt something inside me shift. It didn't feel monumental or transformational, but something stirred, like a cotton candy cloud of joy floating just above my chest. I couldn't help but smile as laughter echoed around me. The warmth of celebration seeped in, and for the first time, I understood that my little victory wasn't just writing the book, it was finally allowing myself to indulge in the enjoyment of it all. And that's when I noticed a woman, perhaps in her 50s, sitting alone at a table across from me. She looked contemplative, nursing her own cup of coffee. Her features were softened by the lines of wisdom and a mysterious aura emanated from her. Feeling bold from my own little celebration, I waved at her with a shy smile. To my surprise, she returned it, walking over to my table. "I couldn't help but notice your bright disposition," she said warmly, her eyes sparkling with genuine curiosity. We introduced ourselves. Evelyn was her name. We chatted about everything and nothing, our conversation flowing as naturally as the coffee we sipped. And with every word, I realized Evelyn had her own stories of triumph and hardship. She shared tales of her art gallery, dreams deferred, and roller coasters of joy and frustration alike. It was a bittersweet symphony. Both of us lamented on past disappointments, but within that shared moment over coffee and cake, we found something painfully beautiful. That day, within those cafe walls, I learned to celebrate not just my achievements, but the stories behind every button I clicked and every page I turned, her tales weaving with mine, echoing against the humiliating comparisons I once clung to. By the end of our talk, a strange sense of elation pulsed through me. I bid farewell to Evelyn, feeling lighter than I'd felt in years. As I exited the cafe, the rain had begun to drizzle softly, adding a melodic undertone to the peace I had finally embraced. I looked skyward, watching the raindrops glisten, each one a reminder of everything I overcame, no matter how insignificant it seemed. With that experience brimming in my heart, I pledged to embrace my palette of successes, big or small, that colored my existence. That night, as I reflected on the day's events, my phone buzzed once more with notifications, yet this time, instead of dread, I felt empowerment. Each post, each celebration invoked a quiet cheer from me. Here's the captivating twist: there's a world of ambition around us, but there's also a world of interwoven experiences, and we are all deserving of a moment to claim our worth. From that day onward, I made it a goal, no matter how small, each day to honor my victories, even the itsy-bitsy ones, finishing a tough workout, turning in a tedious assignment, or simply enjoying a cup of coffee. I remember the warmth in that cafe circle embracing me, and it became a habit I would cherish for a lifetime, awakening me to the boundless spirit of connection and community. Even the smallest feats are worthy celebrations, and we don't always need extravagant accomplishments to prove our significance. And so, I learned how to celebrate my achievements, forging ahead, each day a new reason to revel. Maybe it was just the power of a slice of chocolate cake or the influence of a stranger in a cozy cafe, but it transformed me, revealing that happiness lies not between the comparisons, but in stories like ours, waiting to be celebrated. And if you take the time to look, you'll see those little victories shining brightly, guiding the way through all the shadows until you finally learn to dance with your own light. When I stood up for a cause, a meaningful protest, it was just an ordinary Thursday evening when the notification pinged on my phone, vibrating against the worn wooden table, interrupting my half-hearted attempt at finishing my paper on climate change. A local activist group had posted an urgent call to action, a peaceful protest scheduled for Saturday afternoon in front of the town hall. They were rallying against the recent approval of a controversial pipeline project that would tear through our small town, bringing with it a slew of environmental risks and the potential for disaster. I hadn't been active in civic matters since college, but something about the urgency in their post struck a chord deep within me. Maybe it was the vision of oil spills in our pristine rivers or the thought of my niece playing in toxic playground soil someday. I decided then and there that I would attend, feeling both a thrill of resolve and a twinge of anxiety as I thought about standing shoulder to shoulder with strangers. Saturday came faster than I expected, and I found myself wearing a thrifted shirt that read, "Earth First." As I mingled with a sea of like-minded individuals. The atmosphere was electric, people of all ages braided together by a common goal. I felt nervous, yet strangely empowered, as we rallied behind a banner that said, "Protect our home." As noon approached, a sense of unity spread amongst us, punctuated by chants and the sound of drums that reverberated against the brick walls of Town Hall. But just as I began to feel comfortable, the air shifted. A trail of black SUVs rolled up, and I was struck by an uneasy feeling as the occupants emerged, men in expensive suits, flanked by a squad of security personnel. They strode confidently towards our crowd, and just like that, the atmosphere transformed from jubilant to tense. My heart raced as I realized they were the corporate lobbyists, the architects of the disaster we were protesting against. They didn't come to debate, they came to intimidate. That's when something snapped inside me. I had spent my life letting fear dictate my choices, but now, with everything at stake, I refused to cower. Biting back my fear, I stepped forward, my voice shaky yet cutting through the clamor. "We won't let you destroy our home," I shouted, my heart pounding in my chest. The crowd hushed for a split second, surprised at my audacity. Then, as if that single spark ignited a fuse, others began to chant with me, louder and louder until it felt like we were an unbreakable wave crashing against their wall of suits. I could see their expressions shift. They were taken aback, perhaps underestimating the resolve that could bubble up from ordinary people like us. But then, they smirked, as if they had seen it all before and had a plan ready. One of the men stepped forward, hands raised as if to calm us. "This is unnecessary," he said, his voice oozing condescension. The project is already approved. It's out of your hands now. His arrogance infuriated me but fueled the fire in my belly. I didn't know what to do next, but I knew we couldn't back down. We had to push back harder. As we held our ground, a few others joined me at the forefront, emboldened by my words. Stand with us, I called, and amidst the chants, a transformation happened. This protest morphed into something more than just a demonstration. This was a fight for our lives, our clean air, our kids' futures. Our passion turned visceral, and worry morphed into righteous anger. I spotted a spray bottle with bright pink paint near one of the drums, and in a sudden act of desperation, I snatched it up and splattered the pink goo across the pristine white sign of the corporate lobbyists. This is what you're doing to our planet, I yelled, heart racing as the crowd erupted in cheers. My reckless act of vandalism shot adrenaline through our ranks, transforming the atmosphere again, transmuting dismay into action. Before I knew it, others were taking up paint, and suddenly the lobbyist's pristine sign turned into a canvas of solidarity and strength. The men in suits turned visibly agitated, their polished facade lost to the chaos of our shared defiance. One of them, the one who initially spoke, stepped closer, jaw clenched, ready to retaliate. But I held my ground, voice steady as I shouted, "You can't silence us. We will not stand by while you destroy our home." The firm resolve in my words seemed to make him hesitate. Maybe it was the tenacity in our voices, or perhaps he just realized he was outnumbered. It was at that tense moment that sirens wailed in the distance, echoing down the empty street. My breath caught in my throat as the protesters' chants reached a fever pitch. Police arrived, their faces a mixture of disbelief and confusion as they assessed the situation before them. More suited men surrounded by security officials glared daggers at us, and tensions flared. "This is a peaceful protest," I called out, championing the spirit and intent of our movement, hoping the officers would recognize our cause rather than criminalize our passion. The officers looked at the usually docile crowd of citizens, transformed into a passionate wave of fervor, and decided to hold their ground. They didn't approach us as aggressors but rather stood by, observing as we became a chaotic symphony of voices. The environment felt alive, charged with a mix of adrenaline and fear that rose with every chant, every splash of paint. As we engaged with the lobbyists, fueled by a desire to protect our land, I felt myself becoming part of something larger than I ever anticipated. The corporate men attempted to interject again, their arrogance now replaced with annoyance, but at that moment, our voices harmonized into a battle cry that drowned them out. Our shouts became a shield, protecting us from their disdain. When they realized their efforts were futile, they conferred in bitter tones, clearly exasperated by our resilience. And then, the unthinkable happened. With a wide grin, one of them pulled out his phone, likely to record us, to use against our movement, and I felt molten anger surge through my veins. I had been part of a society that had swallowed fear for far too long. Every day, the ambient sounds of indifference cloaked us in a fabric of apathy. But here and now, I felt liberated. I rushed to grab a handful of the vibrant paint and aimed it straight toward him, smearing the fire of our cause onto the cold, sterile corporate fabric. The crowd gasped, and in that split moment of chaos, I knew we had crossed a line, but in our hearts, we had already won. The moment crystallized forever in my memory, me, standing against a patriarchal wave of capitalism, my heart roaring not just for myself but for everyone who had been silenced for too long. All at once, a sense of euphoria rolled through me, a flicker of hope against the machines that try to grind us down. As the police officers remained passive, witnessing our tenacity, the tension broke, and the rally unfolded into a spectacular show of invaluable human spirit. We painted our fight directly onto the very fabric of their intentions, and it felt exhilarating. With our colors, we reclaimed our voices, our right to stand up against threats to our existence. Eventually, the lobbyists retreated, their plans thwarted not by violence, but by the signature colors of unity and empowerment we turned into art. It was no longer just protest, it had become a movement. I turned to the crowd with tears in my eyes, and for the first time, I saw faces of real change, faces that reflected the passionate heritage of this earth. We pacified the storm that day, marking our place in history with paint, pride, and promises to stand vigilantly for our cause, no matter the odds. When we walked away that day, filled with adrenaline, we knew this was just the beginning. That fight wasn't merely for approval or acceptance, it was a full-throated call against numbness, an embrace of what could be, and a commitment to protect every breath we took. It was in the heat of that moment that I realized, sometimes you need to stand up, even if it means getting a little paint on your hands.
My wife just admitted that she's an alcoholic. And it doesn't stop there. It happened on a quiet Tuesday night, the kind where the world outside feels like a distant echo, and I sat at the kitchen table, staring blankly at the cold remnants of dinner while she cleaned up after me, humming a tune that sounded too cheerful for our conversation earlier about bills and work stress. When she finally set down the last dish, she turned to me with a glimmer of something in her eyes that should have sent alarms ringing, but I caught it only as a flicker of vulnerability. "I need to tell you something," she said, words tasting of desperation, and I felt my stomach drop. I braced myself. Over the years, we had weathered most storms, job loss, family woes, but nothing could have prepared me for her next confession. "I've been drinking more than I let on. It's not just a glass of wine anymore, it's a bottle, sometimes two, and it's becoming all I think about." I nodded, trying to absorb the weight of her admission while tidal waves of pain crashed around me, pulling me under. I wanted to reach for her, to tell her it was okay, as if in saying that I could somehow fix what felt irreparably broken, but a different thought clawed at my mind. I remembered the nights when she'd suddenly disappear, the mornings she'd stumble out of bed, bleary-eyed and barely coherent. A chill ran down my spine as I connected the dots. Those were not just late nights with friends but something darker lurking behind her smile. "How long?" I managed to ask, my voice a strangled whisper, and she looked away, biting her lip hard enough that I swore I could see the weight of her guilt carving grooves into her skin. "Months, maybe even years." I thought I could control it. "Maybe just until things got better." Each word seemed to pull us deeper into a chasm of despair, and I felt the distance between us expanding like an insatiable void. In that moment, I remembered a night 2 weeks prior, when she said she had to work late, but came home far too late, reeking of alcohol and shame. I had brushed it off, attributing it to a rough day, but now it screamed a different story. "Is it just the drinking?" I asked, dread coiling around my thoughts. Her eyes widened, and I felt a cold sweat prick my skin. Something was bound to fall out of her mouth like an unrevealed monster lurking within our lives, something too dark to be contained by the feeble walls of our home. "No. Not just that, I've been seeing someone." The confession hit like a punch to the gut. "What do you mean?" I asked, breathless and hollow, as images of betrayal flickered through my mind, shadows of mistrust taking shape. "I didn't mean to, it just. He was there for me when you weren't." She stumbled over her words, tears spilling from her eyes as if they were the very dam containing every wretched secret she had buried. "He understood, and every time I tried to push him away, I never could." The ugliness of it clawed at me, gripping my heart with a vice-like force, and for a moment, I couldn't think beyond the rising storm of fury and sadness. Every stolen moment, every secret rendezvous now replayed like a haunting symphony, and I could hardly breathe under the weight of her confessions. "Are you in love with him?" I asked, the words tasting like ashes in my mouth, but she shook her head, and for the first time, I felt a flicker of hope amidst the chaos. "No. It was just an escape, I swear." But those words brought no relief and only made me wonder who else could have been dragged into her spiral. "How many?" I pressed, feeling sick for needing to know, but there was no way around the truth falling heavier with every syllable. "Just one," she said, her voice cracking like fragile glass. But it meant everything, even if it was nothing. I thought I could stop, but I can't seem to pull away from the bottle or him. It's like I'm losing myself. I wanted to scream at her, to shake her until her truths spilled from her fingers like sand, but the image of the woman I loved, fragmented and raw, silenced my fury. Instead, I took a deep breath, and though it felt impossible to put that air back in my lungs, I asked the question that already echoed in my mind. "Who is he?" She lowered her gaze, taking a step back as if my inquiry was a physical blow. The pause stretched out into a silence so heavy, I felt its mass hanging between us, suffocating what was left of my trust. "Someone I met at the support group I stopped attending when I thought I had it under control," she finally confessed, her voice barely above a whisper. "A man who would later go on to show me that I had worth." Before it all spiraled, my world tilted, and the floor felt like water beneath my feet. The nights she spent out were far worse than I ever imagined, and with each revelation, her words cut deeper. In that moment, I didn't just feel betrayal, I felt anger towards myself for not seeing the signs, for ignoring the warnings whispering through our life together. "I don't know what to do," I said finally, desperation bubbling into my chest. I love you, but all of this. It feels insurmountable. And for the first time, her expression shifted entirely, morphing from regret to something far darker, inscrutable as shadows danced behind her eyes and the moonlight filtered through the window. Maybe you were never meant to, she replied, a chilling smile curling on her lips. Maybe the truth can only be faced in the darkness. Confusion clouded my thoughts. What did she mean by that? What do you? But the words disintegrated in the flood of confusion engulfing my heart. Then she turned away from me, heading toward the back room, and I felt an instinctive jolt of fear for a reason I couldn't quite grasp. Wait, where are you going? I called out, rising from my chair and following her as the uncertainty twisted tighter around my throat. She paused in the doorway, illuminated by the dim light from the kitchen, a ghost woven into the fabric of our love. You'll see, she said cryptically, disappearing into the darkness of the room, and I hesitated only for a moment before stepping over the threshold. My heart pounded in rhythm with my mounting dread, but I needed to know, I needed closure to the fragments of a love that felt increasingly unreal. But as I entered the room, it was not the empty space I expected. Instead, it was dark and humid, with a scent of something sickly sweet in the air, a smell that caused the hair on the back of my neck to stand on end. Flickering candlelight danced off the walls, accompanied by the unsettling aroma of alcohol, and my pulse quickened as I stepped further inside. What the hell is going on? I demanded, squinting at her silhouette hovering around a small table cluttered with empty bottles and frayed photographs. You shouldn't have come in here. Her voice was low, almost menacing, and suddenly all at once, everything twisted grotesquely in place. The laughter and warmth we once shared felt heavy with the weight of something sinister, and I could see now that the room glistened with more than just spilled liquor. There were trinkets, a ring, a watch, items that didn't belong to either of us but were undeniably a part of her descent. These are the remnants, she murmured, her eyes reflecting a wild intensity. The ones who got too close. It hit me like a slap to the face, the pieces falling into place in a way I could never have imagined. You didn't just escape, you took. You took other men. She smiled, no, grinned, and it was something so alien, so twisted, it felt like gazing into the void. They don't last long, you know, once they fall, they become part of me. My own mind swirled, realizing I was not just learning about a woman grappling with addiction and infidelity, I was uncovering something dark, eldritch, an entity lurking beneath her skin, thriving in the chaos, feeding off the despair of those she ensnared. Horror coursed through me as I understood, the nights she vanished were not just pleas for escapism, they were offerings to something unholy, a desperate bid to silence it in exchange for temporary solace. You've got to stop, I cried, but even as I spoke, I felt the room constricting around me, an unseen force closing in with a sinister hunger. I can't. It won't let me, she replied, her voice a cacophony of anguish and thrill, like the whisper of ghosts cradled in each word. Reality unraveled as her body shuddered, caught in the throes of battle against the darkness I now knew lived within her. A reality flared to life and twisted, reshaping the roles of husband and wife into something grotesque, something I could no longer recognize. Please, I begged, scrambling back as shadows coiled around her like serpents, and in the growing maelstrom of fear, I tried to reach for her, but my touch was met with an icy shock as though my fingertips passed through glass. It's too late for me, she laughed, a manic sound that cracked like thunder. But you? You're just beginning to understand. With a force so sudden it knocked the breath from my lungs, she surged toward me, her eyes glinting with the premonition of ruin, and I felt the encroaching terror claw at my chest. It was, in that moment, the first time I truly comprehended the full weight of her addiction, not just to alcohol but to everything dark and twisted that she could steal from others, and I stumbled backward, a whirlwind of dread spiraling around me as I grasped her final revelation. I thought I lost you to the drink and the men, I gasped, but that wasn't it at all. You've become something darker. The world faded beneath the crescendo of her deranged laughter that echoed, growing louder, as shadows tore around me. The truth had taken hold deep inside, transforming a once beloved partner into something unfathomable, and as the dark consumed her, I realized I was helplessly bound in a web of horrors I could never escape.
I was scrolling through my social media feed one night when I stumbled upon a video that would change my life forever. It featured a span of a few minutes, showcasing various people recounting their most traumatic experiences, all labeled flaws and all. My initial thought was to scroll past, but something about the title struck a chord deep within. I clicked on the video. It was heart-wrenching but oddly cathartic listening to them, tears and laughter entwined as they opened up about their battles with addiction, depression, identity issues, and heartbreak. Each story resonated with me, as if they were unearthing emotions I had buried beneath layers of denial. I felt compelled to share my own tale, though I had never spoken about my flaws and fractured past with anyone. Most nights, I would replay the whispers of disappointment inside my head as I lay in bed, my failures echoing louder than any dreams I'd ever had. It began with a pencil sketch I had drawn in architecture class. The project was supposed to encapsulate my vision for a sustainable future, but to me, it was just a half-hearted mess. I knew my classmates excelled in their artistic endeavors, while I seemed perpetually lost. My instructor called me in after class one day. Hushed whispers filled the hall as he placed my drawing under a harsh fluorescent light. "This isn't your best work, is it?" he said, eyeing me carefully. I was expecting a pitying lecture, so when he leaned in closer and added, "You have potential, but potential means nothing if you don't push yourself," it unsettled me more than I could express. I shrugged it off, nothing seemed worth the effort. I started drowning my insecurities in distractions. Idly, I sat scrolling through social media, chasing likes on pictures that barely existed, searching for fleeting approval. In this haze, I found solace in a community of gamers online. We built an oasis away from reality where I finally felt accepted, flawed characteristics temporarily forgotten amidst the cheering of fellow players. I adopted a persona, a skilled gamer, so adept that I earned respect. But with every level I attempted to conquer, the underlying emptiness escalated. My grades plummeted, friendships dwindled, and the scabs of my neglect began to bleed. I fell into a spiral of isolation, haunted by doubts that clawed at my mind day in and day out. I tried confronting my demons, diving into meditation, attending support groups, anything that could lift me out of this abyss. All the while, I felt like an actor performing in a tragedy, pains masked by smiles. One stormy night, I got an ominous message from the gaming community that had once felt like home. A gamer, a friend I had trusted, revealed sensitive information about me to our group, my past failure, my struggle with self-worth, my unwavering fear of being judged. Suddenly, the sanctuary I had built around me crumbled. I set my profile to private and withdrew, feeling a dreadful weight suffocating me. For weeks, I felt invisible. The loss of connection turned into desperation and loneliness, and I fell back into dark thoughts. I often felt like a ghost, floating through the days, my reflections warping into distorted images of who I used to be. One day, I found myself in a park. I watched children play without a care in the world, families laughing under the warm sun. I realized I had forgotten how to be happy, disconnected from reality in a web of despair. That evening, I returned to the video I had discovered so many weeks earlier. The recountings were haunting but filled with a warmth I couldn't deny. I started rewatching them, listening more intently. What struck me was how each person had transformed their flaws into something meaningful, how they wore their scars as badges of honor. It dawned on me that our journeys could overlap, a tapestry of experiences stitched together by trials and tribulations. I took a breath and decided to write about my own journey. The next morning, I opened my laptop, fingers trembling over the keys. Something inside me shifted, and I typed relentlessly. I poured my insecurities, doubts, failures, and uncertainties into words, crafting a story embodying every dark moment and ache I held inside. The act of writing propelled me towards self-acceptance. I discovered that my flaws did not define me but rather shaped the narrative of who I was becoming. After finishing, I found the original video's channel and posted my response in the comments along with a link to my story. I didn't expect much, perhaps a like or two, but what I received was extraordinary. Within hours, thousands of comments poured in, and my story resonated with so many people. They thanked me for being honest, admitting they too had struggled with similar issues. Strangers reached out, offering support, and for the first time in ages, I felt a sense of belonging. Realizing that imperfection is a universal experience, I began to appreciate my journey. I started sharing my story on various forums, continuing to connect with others who battled their demons. Each new interaction filled me with hope, reminding me that we are all flawed yet beautiful. I now feel an overwhelming sense of gratitude for the struggles I faced. They led me to this renewed love of who I am, despite every ugly stitch woven into my existence. I learned to appreciate not only the victories but the failures that shaped my story. The video that had once caught my eye transformed into a lifeline, a catalyst for change. Today, I wake up every morning determined to embrace my journey, flaws and all. I invite you to share in this truth: it's okay to be imperfect. In fact, it's more than okay. It's beautiful, and remember, there's a whole community waiting to embrace you, too. Don't hide away, reach out. You may be surprised how many souls are echoing your story, just waiting for you to take that first step. My husband's family expects me to pay for their lavish vacation. I never thought I'd be in a situation like this, but here I am, caught in the crosshairs of family expectations and financial burden. My husband, Ben, and I had always enjoyed a comfortable life together, but we weren't wealthy by any means. We worked hard for what we had, saving up for vacations and special moments. That's why, when Ben's family announced their plans for a lavish vacation to a tropical paradise, I felt a pit forming in my stomach. It was meant to be a joyful reunion, a way for everyone to bond and celebrate family togetherness. But when the family group chat lit up with excitement about the trip, I noticed something alarming: the assumption that I would contribute significantly to the cost. At first, I tried to brush it off as a misunderstanding. I was busy with work and preparing for our upcoming move, so I didn't have time to engage in the chatter. But when I received a direct message from Ben's sister, Chloe, it became clear that my silence had been interpreted as agreement. "Hey, we're counting on you to help cover some of the expenses for the vacation. It's going to be amazing, and it wouldn't be the same without you." I felt my heart sink. My mind raced as I processed the implications. Why should I be expected to pay for a vacation that I hadn't even planned for? I messaged Ben, hoping to get his support. "Can you talk to your family about this? I don't think it's fair for me to shoulder part of the cost." Ben's response was disappointing. "They're just excited, and they've always seen you as part of the family. Can't you help out a little? It'll mean a lot to them." I felt a mix of anger and confusion. Why was he siding with them? I had always been there for his family, supporting their events and gatherings, but this felt different. It felt like an obligation rather than a choice. Days turned into a week, and the pressure mounted. Chloe and Ben's parents kept messaging me about the trip, sending links to luxurious resorts, lavish dinners, and excursions that were far beyond our budget. "We'll all pitch in, and it'll be unforgettable," they said, but I knew that my pitching in meant far more than a share of the costs. It meant sacrificing my own hard-earned savings. One evening, as I sat on the couch, scrolling through the family chat, I saw that Ben's cousin had posted a photo of a stunning villa they wanted to stay at, along with a breakdown of costs that sent my heart racing. "We can each chip in $1,500. It'll be worth it." I stared at the screen in disbelief. This was outrageous. I could feel my blood boiling as I typed a response, only to stop myself. I didn't want to cause conflict, but I also couldn't just let this slide. That night, I confronted Ben. "I can't go through with this. I can't pay that much for a vacation that's supposed to be a family trip. It feels wrong," he sighed, running his fingers through his hair. "They're just excited. Can't you try to see it from their perspective? It's not like they're asking for a lot." "Not a lot." I shot back, my voice rising. "That's a significant amount of money for us. I don't understand why I'm being pressured into this." He looked at me, frustration etched on his face. "It's family. Just think about how much it would mean to them. They don't have a lot of chances to get together like this." I felt utterly alone. It seemed like I was fighting a losing battle against expectations, and I couldn't understand why Ben couldn't see my side. Over the next few days, the pressure mounted further. I was bombarded with messages from his family, each one more insistent than the last. "We're counting on you. It'll be so much fun. You can't let us down." It felt like a wave of guilt was crashing over me, pulling me under. I decided to take a stand. I texted the family group chat, stating clearly that while I loved them and wanted to be part of the trip, I could not afford to contribute in the way they expected. The response was immediate and explosive. "What do you mean you can't help out? This is a family vacation. We're all in this together." I felt a knot tighten in my stomach as the messages flew back and forth. Ben's family, the same people I had spent years growing close to, turned on me in an instant. I read their messages, feeling the sting of their words. Selfish. Ungrateful. I was taken aback by how quickly their support turned to hostility. My heart raced, and I could feel the panic rising. Ben tried to mediate, but his efforts only fueled the fire. "You're making them feel bad," he said. "You don't want to ruin this for everyone, do you?" I felt crushed, like the very ground beneath me was crumbling away. I had stood my ground, yet it felt like I was the one being punished. The emotional toll was exhausting. I tried to focus on work, but my mind kept drifting back to the family drama. I couldn't shake the feeling that I was losing a part of my family. One night, after an especially tense day, I heard Ben on the phone with his mom, his voice hushed but filled with urgency. I could make out bits of their conversation, and my heart sank as I heard her say, "Maybe she's just not the right fit for our family." I felt a wave of nausea wash over me. Was this really happening? My stomach twisted with anxiety as I realized that the family I had loved and supported for years was now questioning my place among them because I wouldn't pay for their lavish vacation. I confronted Ben afterward, my voice shaking with hurt. "How could you let them talk about me like that? I thought we were a team." He looked guilty but defensive. "You need to understand. They're just trying to include you, and maybe you should consider that they're right. You don't want to be the one who ruins this for everyone." His words struck me like a slap to the face. It felt like I was standing on the edge of a cliff, teetering between the life I had built with Ben and the reality of being pushed away by his family. The following days felt like an emotional roller coaster. I spent countless hours scrolling through their group chat, seeing them make plans and jokes, all while I felt like an outsider. Finally, the day of the trip arrived, and I was a bundle of nerves. I had made it clear I wouldn't be attending, but part of me wished I could just pack my bags and join them, ignoring the hurt and resentment. As I watched them board the plane and the group photos flooding my feed, I felt a profound sense of loss wash over me. It was as if I was witnessing my life slipping through my fingers. I realized I had sacrificed my own happiness to fit into a mold that no longer served me. In the weeks that followed, Ben and I struggled to find common ground. He was torn between his family and his wife, and the tension hung in the air like a storm cloud. I could sense the frustration building between us, and as much as I wanted to bridge the gap, every attempt felt futile. Then, one day, I received a message from Ben. "I think it's best if we take a break." The words shattered me. My heart raced as I read and reread the message, hoping it was a mistake. But deep down, I knew this was the reality I had feared. I had stood my ground for what I believed in, but now I was facing the consequences. As the days turned into weeks, I began to pick up the pieces of my shattered life. I focused on my work, threw myself into my hobbies, and started to rediscover who I was outside of my relationship with Ben. The pain was raw, but I slowly learned to accept that sometimes, standing up for yourself meant facing difficult choices. In the end, I learned that love shouldn't come with a price tag, and family shouldn't demand sacrifices that push you away. It was a painful journey, but it was one I had to take to find my own strength. I learned to embrace the power of self-worth, even if it meant letting go of what I thought was a forever kind of love. If you're reading this, know that it's okay to set boundaries, to say no, and to prioritize your own happiness. Sometimes, the hardest choices lead to the most profound growth, and no one should ever feel obligated to pay for someone else's dreams at the cost of their own happiness. I never thought of myself as someone who would ever step outside their comfort zone, let alone enjoy it. I'm 28, an introvert at heart, and the thought of anything that shakes up my routine, going to parties, talking to strangers, anything that feels unfamiliar, makes my heart race and my palms sweaty. That all changed one fateful night when my best friend, Jake, convinced me to join him on what he described as the adventure of a lifetime. For weeks, he had been raving about this underground rave happening in the middle of the woods. At first, I dismissed it outright. No way was I going to be that person dancing under a canopy of trees, surrounded by strangers, all while deep bass thumped in my ears. But after relentless persuasion and a little bit of FOMO creeping in, I found myself saying yes, though with a heavy heart. The night arrived, and with every decision leading to that moment, my anxiety only multiplied. It was late autumn, the trees glistened with a mix of dying leaves and chilling mist, and the air was sharp like the edge of a knife. My adrenaline spiked as we parked the car a mile away from the location, an effort to keep the event hidden from prying eyes. Jake led the way, my feet crunching on twigs and fallen leaves as we walked deeper into the woods. The distant sound of music mingled with the rustling around us, growing louder the deeper we went. Moments of self-doubt flashed through my mind, but Jake grabbed my hand, urging me onward. I could hear laughter and voices swirling around, an intoxicating allure to move forward, and despite my hesitation, I pushed past the unease. As we emerged into a clearing, I was met with the sight of lights flashing in various colors, projecting wild patterns through fog that seemed to snake its way among the trees. It was surreal, a beautiful, chaotic nebula of humanity. People danced, some in outlandish costumes, and every bit of my introverted spirit screamed at me to turn back, but the moment butterflies fluttered in my stomach, I felt a pull against my better judgment. Jake disappeared into the crowd, and suddenly I was alone. I stood there, awkwardly swaying as I observed this new world, feeling like a fish out of water. I wanted to leave, my mind screamed at me to escape this unfamiliar and terrifying place, but something else, a strange curiosity, kept me rooted in place. That's when a girl approached me, her neon pink hair glowing under the black lights, eyes sparkling like diamonds. She wore a vibrant pair of wings attached to her back, and the moment she smiled, I felt oddly welcomed. "Hey! You look lost," she chirped, her voice light and inviting. "What's your name?" I told her, struggling to hide my nervousness. Her name was Hazel. We talked for a little while, and before I realized it, she had your typical bubbly energy that began to infect me. "You should dance with me," she insisted, pulling me toward the thrumming crowd. I hesitated but couldn't bring myself to deny her. I'd never danced in my life, mindful of how awkward I looked, but something deep inside me longed to be part of this enchantment, and it felt easier with her. So I let myself be swept away. The music pulsed through my veins, and I followed Hazel's movements, allowing the rhythm to take hold of me. I moved, slowly at first, uncertain of how to let go, yet the energy enveloped me. With each beat, I loosened up and forgot my reservations. I was no longer the introverted wallflower but rather a part of something electric. For the first time, I felt alive. Hours slipped by, and before I knew it, we were dancing, laughing, and talking as if we had known each other for years. People came and went, we were nothing more than two souls wrapped in music and light. The fire of spontaneity burned brighter than I ever imagined possible. It struck me in that moment, I was stepping outside of everything I had ever known, embracing a world long kept from me, filled with fervor, connection, and electrical energy. However, as the night wore on, the crowd began to thicken, the scene becoming wilder, slightly chaotic. I noticed the atmosphere shifting, the laughter began to fade and replaced by whispers of anxiety. At that moment, I spotted a commotion in the corner of my eye. Something was wrong. People were tense, eyes darting. I caught glimpses of two figures arguing, their voices rising above the music, then a scuffle broke out. People scattered as chaos erupted. It was a completely different vibe, the once harmonious place became a frenzy of panic and confusion. My heart dropped as I instinctively grabbed Hazel's hand, pulling her away from the chaos, my innate fear flaring back up. "Let's get out of here," I shouted over the turmoil, dragging her toward the edge of the dance floor. But we were swept up in it as the crowd panicked, pushing us every which way among a sea of faces. It felt like a nightmare, the music that once felt like freedom now morphing into chaos, swallowing hope. I could feel fear clawing at my insides as we maneuvered, adrenaline coursing through us. Suddenly, as if the world sensed our turmoil, the music stopped abruptly, and a chilling silence enveloped us. Jake, looking frantic, came wading through the crowd and spotted us. "We need to go, now," he yelled, urgency flooding his tone. Just then, I turned to face the main stage, where the source of the chaos was revealed. A group had appeared, shouting, their intentions unclear but dangerous. The security team hadn't arrived yet, and with everything spiraling, I had never felt more terrified in my life. We pushed through the crowd, hearts racing until we finally reached the edge of the woods. The air felt heavy, every breath mingling with the trepidation surrounding us. Jake, Hazel, and I sprinted away from the clearing, fear propelling us deeper into the trees. My heart pounded in my chest, and I could hear the distant shouts behind us. I pressed on, the adrenaline blocking out the pain in my legs. We finally reached the car, breathless and shaken. My fingers fumbled to unlock it as we darted inside. I was overwhelmed with relief, but something else simmered beneath the surface, a realization that I had pushed past every limit I had built for myself. While my evening had veered into chaos, I had danced, laughed, and met new people. I had stepped outside my comfort zone in a way I'd never dreamed possible. This surreal, chaotic night ended with a moment of sheer realization: I survived. We compiled into the car, hearts still racing, but in the rearview mirror, I could see the glow of that party, of liberation and life. It wasn't about that moment of turmoil, it was everything that led up to it that taught me the value in stepping outside that uncomfortable zone. I embraced the chaos, welcomed the uncertainty, and for the first time, I truly felt alive. Sure, it was terrifying, but I wouldn't trade that moment for anything. I learned something fundamental about myself that night. Sometimes the fears we hold can keep us from some of life's most beautiful experiences. As we drove away, the music still echoed in my mind, a reminder that outside of those walls of comfort lies a world waiting to be explored, and if you're brave enough to take that leap, even if it gets messy, you might just find a place you truly love.
When I was a kid, my mom would often forget my existence, and it felt like our house was just a set of walls wearing the skin of the family, devoid of love or warmth. Birthdays were spent in silence, where I would blow out my candles while she stared blankly at her phone, and school plays were met with empty seats where I so desperately wanted her to be, only to later find her scrolling through social media, claiming she had prior commitments. Throughout the years, my friends sensed the void and tried to fill it with their own families, for which I was infinitely grateful, but the ache of my mother's absence was stifling. By the time I reached my teenage years, I was determined to be the opposite of her. I wandered into social clubs, forged new friendships, and leaned on surrogate parents who saw me for who I was. I dreamed of a wedding day bathed in love and support, surrounded by those who cherished me. Fast forward to my engagement, and the planning was thrilling until the moment my mom called me. She wanted to talk about dresses, flowers, and how she couldn't wait to be at my side. It shocked me. I had lived in a shadow where she rarely acknowledged my achievements, let alone my milestones. The memories of her dismissals flooded back like a tidal wave, drowning out the joy of my impending nuptials. I remember telling her, voice trembling with a mix of anger and hurt, that I wasn't comfortable with her being a part of the wedding. It felt like an enormous weight had been lifted off my chest, but her silence on the other end showed me that she was just as aloof as ever. Friends and family, who knew the history, stood by me, calling me brave and self-aware. They understood that her absence was a wound I'd carried too long to let her walk down that aisle like she had been by my side all these years. But just days before the wedding, I received a letter from my mom. The words were shaky and filled with remorse, reflecting a woman trying to recall who I was. "I may have been absent," she wrote, "but I am still your mother. Please let me be there on your special day. Maybe we can start anew?" The conflicting emotions hit me hard like a truck. Could someone who had ignored me for years really want to fix things at the last minute? The day of the wedding arrived. The venue was beautiful, draped with flowers, and everyone I loved encircled me. My heart swelled as my soon-to-be spouse took my hands. The ceremony began, and laughter and joy filled the air, everything that had been missing for so long. But then, out of the corner of my eye, my mom stepped in, her wrinkled face almost unrecognizable against the light, seemingly floating in a sheer white dress that clashed horrifically with my colors. My heart sank, and I suddenly felt trapped, surrounded by love while being suffocated by resentment. The words she once spoke melted into a long-forgotten childhood echo. She smiled wide, thinking it was all forgiven like it was a bad dream we could wake up from. Panic surged through me as guests noticed her presence, shifting their attention from the altar to the dissonance unfolding before them. It felt like a wretched scene in a horror film, where the doors are flung open, and the monster emerges, but in this case, it was my mom, reminding me of all the voids I had struggled to fill. The soft music shifted into an eerie silence, the world around me began to fade, and I was left holding the weight of my choice. I stepped forward, shaking, not knowing whether to scream or cry. With her hand reaching out to me, I felt a paralysis of feelings I didn't know existed: love, fear, hatred, and duty all roiling in my gut. It was the moment I was meant to be standing where joy thrived, but instead, I felt like a ghost of my past. Memories crashed in like the plates I had once broken against the wall in anger, each fragment representing an unfulfilled mother's embrace. "What are you doing here?" I finally asked, voice trembling. A silence hung thick, the sound of my heart pounding echoed off the walls as her smile faltered. The world was watching. I had a decision to make: to let her in, despite the years of neglect, or to sever the bond that tried to tether me back to a place I never belonged. In that moment, I turned my back on her. Muffled gasps filled the air as I walked back towards the altar, the warmth of my partner's hand jolting me back to reality as I spoke. "I'm sorry, but I can't do this." And as I stood there, amidst vows and promises, The memory of her fading presence cut deeper than any sharp object could. After the ceremony concluded, I expected anger and fury, but instead heard nothing. She slipped away into the chaos, just like she always had. Months passed, filled with the joyous celebrations of a new life, but whispers of gossip reached me, how spiteful I had been, how harsh the decision seemed to friends, and I'd be lying if I said guilt didn't creep in every now and then. But then, I remembered the weight on my shoulders, the ghost of neglect that surrounded me for so long. Everyone has their stories, but mine felt like a horror story unraveling, where love is often the most horrifying monster of all. As I scrolled through social media one night, distraught over her absence, a post caught my eye, a single image of my mother standing at the very venue, the backdrop draped with flowers where our lives had taken separate paths. The caption read, "That empty feeling. Sometimes love isn't strong enough to fill the void." And I realized that her presence had never been about love, it was just another shadow, another appearance filled with obligation. In the end, I had made my choice. I had chosen people who mattered, those who saw me while I was invisible, and I swore I wouldn't let the ghost of my past haunt my future. So here I am, torn between being that little girl dreaming of her mother's love and the adult who learned to survive without it, wrestling with the consequences of familial ties, and affirming to myself that it's okay to choose those who choose you back. There's power in that decision, one steeped in anguish yet wrapped in self-discovery, and I now carry it with me like a talisman, a cruel lesson but a necessary one, reminding me that sometimes, you must close the door to move forward.
I never thought my anxiety would lead me to such an unusual encounter, one that both terrified and transformed me. I used to dread public settings, crowded cafes, busy elevators, even the local grocery store. Just thinking about being around other people set my mind racing, my heart pounding in my chest like it was trying to escape. On that particular Thursday evening, I had just finished another grueling week at work, and my best friend, Mia, urged me to join her at an art exhibit downtown. "It'll be fun," she insisted, her excitement palpable over the phone. But all I could focus on was the idea of being surrounded by crowds, strangers brushing past me, and the constant chatter that would surely drown out my thoughts. For days, I tried to convince myself to say no. But eventually, after a combination of guilt and a desire to break out of my self-imposed isolation, I relented. "Fine, I'll go, but only for a little while," I reluctantly replied. As the time approached, I prepared myself, donning a comfortable sweater and my most grounding pair of sneakers. My palms were clammy, my stomach churned with unease as I stepped out of my front door, but I pushed through and hopped on the subway, hardly able to focus on anything besides the growing sense of dread gnawing at me. The neon lights and rushing sounds blurred into a surreal dreamscape until I found myself finally at the gallery doors, where Mia greeted me with a wide grin. I wished I could share her enthusiasm, but the way my heart was racing made me feel like a deer caught in headlights. The gallery was packed, an overwhelming sea of bodies moving from one exhibit to the next. I stood stiffly at the entrance, my breath quickening and my head spinning as I scanned the room. The walls adorned with vivid art pieces seemed to swirl in front of my eyes, and I struggled to focus on any one. I felt a tightness in my chest, the panic creeping in slowly. Mia grabbed my hand, and we made our way toward a large piece that resembled a chaotic explosion of color. "Isn't it beautiful?" she cooed. I wanted to agree, but all I could think about was how to escape without making a scene. Just then, I caught sight of a woman across the room who seemed to be staring right at me. I had never seen her before, but something about her seemed familiar. It was as if she existed beyond the realm of typical strangers, standing out against the vibrant backdrop of the gallery. She wore a deep purple dress that flowed like liquid amethyst around her, and her dark hair cascaded over her shoulders like a waterfall. I blinked, and for a moment, it felt like the world around us dimmed, the chatter fading into silence. Her eyes locked onto mine, and I instinctively looked away, letting out a shaky breath. I was in the middle of an internal battle. I wanted to leave, but something anchored my feet to the floor. Mia tugged me toward another painting, and I felt enormous guilt rising. It was all too much. Before I could process my thoughts, I turned to Mia, my voice barely above a whisper. "I think I'm going to head out." "No, please don't," she pleaded, her grip tightening on my arm. "Just breathe. We've barely started. Can we try to enjoy this together?" That's when I looked back at the woman, and to my astonishment, she had moved closer. In the thrumming chaos of the exhibit, she appeared as a calm presence amidst the storm. I held my breath, and somehow, her expression managed to ground me. It was as if she could see my anxiety without me saying a word. I tried to persuade myself that this was all in my head, a figment of my imagination trying to make sense of the overwhelming environment around me. But the woman tilted her head slightly, inviting me to come closer without uttering a single word. Against better judgment, I found myself drifting away from Mia, who was completely engrossed in her own conversation. I approached the woman, my heart hammering. Hi, I said, scarcely believing I had broken the silence. Hi, she replied with a melodic, soothing voice that seemed to wrap around me like a warm embrace. I sensed you were struggling. The energy in this place can be overwhelming, can't it? At that moment, her understanding flooded over me like a wave, washing away some of the tension that had been clenching my chest. Yes, it really is. I heard myself say, amazed that I could speak so freely without feeling the suffocating waves of anxiety crashing down. Would you like to take a walk? She suggested, gesturing toward a quieter corner of the gallery. I hesitated, torn between my instincts to flee and the unexpected comfort I felt in her presence. I glanced back at Mia, who was in deep conversation, oblivious to my plight. The woman smiled warmly, extending her hand. Something about her felt trustworthy, calming, a stark contrast to everything else in that chaotic exhibit. I nodded, and we walked, side by side, into a more serene space. We stopped in front of a large abstract painting, the brushstrokes swirling around like a tempest. Art has a way of speaking to us, she said. Did you know that many people find solace in viewing art? It can act as a mirror to our feelings. I listened intently, mesmerized by her passion. Talking with her felt like therapy, like she was unlocking the wall I had built around myself. We stood in silence, letting the colors of the painting wash over us, and slowly, I found myself breathing easier. What's your name? I finally ventured, breaking the magical moment. I'm Alara, she replied, her eyes sparkling with a wisdom that suggested she had experienced these emotional battles herself. And you? I'm Sam, I said, a smile creeping onto my face, surprised at how natural this felt. So, how do you cope with anxiety in public? I asked, curious. Most people count to 10 or focus on something around them, but for me, it helps to connect with nature, I chuckled, not fully understanding how that applied to a crowded gallery, but intrigued by her insight. Maybe you could try it next time, Sam. Close your eyes for a moment. What do you hear? I felt a little silly, but I obliged, closing my eyes. The ambient noise faded into a hum, and for the first time that night, I wasn't only listening to the din of the crowd or feeling the weight of my anxiety. I began to hear snippets of laughter, the click of cameras, the gentle rustle of fabric as people moved. In that moment, I realized I wasn't ultimately alone in this chaos. I opened my eyes, looking at Alara. Something overwhelming shifted inside me, as if her words had crafted a lifeline through my turmoil. Thank you, Alara, I murmured, my heart lifted from a place of dread to one of possibility. She smiled knowingly, and I felt a connection that transcended our brief encounter. Just remember, the world can overwhelm us, but we have the power to connect with it. Take small steps, find what grounds you. You're stronger than your anxiety. With that, she turned away, giving me space. Mia popped into view, eyebrows raised. Where did you go? I was looking for you everywhere. She seemed oblivious to the encounter I'd just experienced, and for a moment, I hesitated, afraid that if I spoke about Alara, I might lose that sense of connection. But as I opened my mouth, I realized my fear was loosening its grip, fading like the sounds of the gallery. I met someone amazing, I finally said. I think I'll be okay. It wouldn't be the last time I faced anxiety, but in that moment, enveloped by the chaos of the evening, I held on to the wisdom Alara had unknowingly gifted me. I felt lighter, more present, as we moved through the exhibit together. Against the vibrant backdrop of color, sounds, and strangers, I found my own space to breathe, one small victory at a time. Thank you for listening to my story. I overheard a life-changing secret at a party. It was supposed to be an ordinary night, just a friend's housewarming party in a neighborhood that was a little too upscale, with the kind of crowd that looked more at home in a magazine spread than in real life. I'd almost skipped it altogether, exhausted from a long week, but something about the invitation had intrigued me. Maybe it was the vague promise of unforgettable surprises, or maybe it was just that itch to escape my usual routine. So, there I was, mingling awkwardly, sipping my drink as I wandered from group to group, feeling like an outsider among people who seemed to have it all figured out. I didn't know many people there, but everyone seemed connected, as though there was some invisible thread binding them together in a way I didn't quite understand. That's when I noticed a small room off to the side, dimly lit, with the door cracked open just enough to catch a glimpse inside. Curiosity got the better of me, and I drifted toward it, peeking inside. There was a man and a woman standing close, their voices low, urgent. I couldn't help but eavesdrop, my hand frozen on the door frame as their conversation unfolded, and in that moment, I felt like I'd stumbled into something I was never meant to hear. The man, whom I recognized as one of the hosts, was whispering frantically about something that sounded like a mistake from years ago, a mistake that he said he could never make right. He kept saying that he couldn't let anyone find out, that if this secret got out, his life would be over. The woman was trying to calm him down, but her own voice trembled with fear, as though she knew the weight of what they were discussing. I didn't understand everything they were saying, but then he mentioned something about a family member, a child who wasn't his, a lie that had somehow spiraled out of control. My mind raced, piecing together bits of their conversation, and suddenly I realized they were talking about something so big, so deeply personal, that it had the power to unravel lives, destroy relationships, tear families apart. The man's voice cracked as he confessed that he'd kept this secret for nearly 20 years, that he'd never planned on revealing it, but recent events had brought it all back to the surface, and he didn't know what to do. I felt a pang of dread in my stomach, the kind of unease that you can't quite explain, that tells you something is terribly wrong. I should have walked away then, pretended I hadn't heard anything, gone back to the party and left these strangers to their twisted mess. But I couldn't move, frozen by the gravity of what I'd just overheard. I didn't know these people, didn't know their story, but suddenly I felt as though I was tangled in their web, as though I had become part of this secret, whether I wanted to be or not. After a few more moments of whispered desperation, they left the room, both of them looking pale and haunted, and I quickly ducked away, pretending to examine a painting on the wall as they passed by. The rest of the night was a blur, the drinks tasted bitter, the laughter around me felt hollow, and I couldn't shake the feeling that I'd just crossed a line, stepped into a world that was darker than I could have imagined. When I got home that night, I couldn't sleep. My mind kept replaying their conversation, the sheer weight of their words pressing down on me. I didn't know what to do with this knowledge, didn't know if I could just forget what I'd heard. Days turned into weeks, and I tried to push it all to the back of my mind, but every time I saw a family laughing together, every time I heard someone talk about trust, or loyalty, or betrayal, the memory would resurface, gnawing at me, haunting me. I started to feel like I was carrying their secret, like it had somehow bled into my own life, staining everything it touched. One day, out of sheer desperation, I decided to confront the host, to tell him what I'd heard and demand an explanation. I didn't know what I'd say or what I hoped to achieve, but I couldn't keep carrying this alone. I tracked him down, cornered him in a quiet cafe, and as soon as he saw me, he knew why I was there. He didn't try to deny it or make excuses, instead, he just looked at me with a kind of resigned acceptance, as though he'd been expecting this day to come. He told me everything, filling in the gaps of what I'd overheard that night. The child he'd spoken of was his son, but not biologically. He'd raised the boy as his own, never revealing the truth to anyone, not even to his wife. The real father had been his best friend, who died in a tragic accident, and he'd made a promise to protect the secret, to keep the child safe, no matter the cost. But now the boy, a young man in his 20s, was asking questions, digging into his past, and the host was terrified that the truth would come out, that his carefully constructed life would collapse around him. He looked at me with pleading eyes, asking me if I could understand why he'd done it, why he'd lied to everyone, why he'd built his life on a foundation of secrets. I didn't know how to respond, didn't know if I could ever truly understand. But I realized then that this secret, this burden, was something he'd carried alone for so long, something that had haunted him in ways I couldn't fully grasp. I walked away from that meeting feeling both heavier and lighter, as though I'd taken a piece of his burden with me, yet somehow freed myself from its grip. I knew then that I could never reveal his secret, that it wasn't mine to share, that I'd stumbled into this world by accident and it wasn't my place to disrupt it. In the end, I never told anyone else what I'd overheard that night. But the experience changed me, made me see people differently, made me understand that everyone carries hidden scars, that we're all fighting battles no one else can see. And even now, years later, I think back to that night, To that secret I overheard, and I wonder if it's still buried, still hidden, or if the truth has finally come to light. Either way, I know that it's not my story to tell, it's a ghost that will haunt me forever, a reminder of the darkness that can lurk beneath the surface, waiting to be discovered. I have been hesitant to share this story, but I think it's time. You'll probably think I'm overreacting or that it's just some creepy tale meant to scare people, but trust me when I say it's real, and it changed everything for me. It all started about 6 months ago when I moved into a new apartment in a quiet neighborhood. I loved how peaceful it was, away from the city chaos. The walls were a warm beige, and the view from the balcony was stunning, overlooking a park filled with towering trees. Things were perfect until my neighbor, Helen, decided to make her presence known. Helen was once a part of my daily routine. She seemed friendly enough at first, always waving when she saw me. But there was an intensity to her gaze that made me uncomfortable. At first, it was just little things. She'd ask about my day, offer me food, and would pop by uninvited, saying she thought she heard something in my apartment. I brushed it off, thinking she was just being neighborly. But then, the visits turned into long conversations that felt intrusive. I began to feel like I was living in a sitcom where the quirky neighbor troubled the main character's life. It was amusing at first until I realized I was losing my sense of privacy. I'd come home from work, and Helen would be waiting in the hallway, claiming she was just passing by. Despite the unease growing in my stomach, I didn't know how to set the boundaries I knew I needed. My attempts at subtlety failed. She'd talk over me and hijack my conversations. After a week of this, she began to show up at odd hours with food, insisting that I join her for a meal, or worse, she'd just walk into my apartment if I left the door half open. I thought about telling her off, but every time I tried to assert myself, she acted as if I were making up issues, emphasizing how we're neighbors and should care for one another. I ended up feeling guilty rather than empowered. One night, after a particularly grueling day, I stumbled into my apartment, exhausted. I locked the door, sighed, and sank onto my couch, hoping for some solace. But not even 10 minutes later, I heard a knock. It was late, and I was in no mood. I peered through the peephole, and there she was, standing outside with a plate of her homemade casserole and that wide smile on her face. I debated, and in a moment of weakness, I opened the door. The second I did, I felt a knot tighten in my gut. Before I knew it, I was trapped in my living room while she talked about nothing and everything, her eyes shining with an unsettling enthusiasm. The casserole hardly tasted better than cardboard, but I felt obligated to choke it down as she watched, her gaze scrutinizing my every bite. I knew I needed to end it. That night, I practiced what I would say to her, what boundaries I'd set, how I would assert my space. I felt empowered, like I was finally ready to reclaim my life. But she was a creature of habit, and the very next day, she showed up at my workplace. She walked straight up to my desk when I was with my boss and declared that I hadn't returned her casserole dish. I felt my face flush as everyone turned to look. My boss raised an eyebrow, clearly intrigued by this odd dynamic. I managed a weak smile, muttered something about needing to discuss it later, but she simply laughed it off. More humiliation ensued, and it started to spiral. I began to avoid calling my friends, worrying she'd somehow show up to invade our time together. I felt myself slipping, retreating further and further into solitude. My sanctuary felt like a prison, and my home had turned into a stage for a play I didn't want to star in. I won't sugarcoat it, I was terrified. I knew she was unhinged, but I didn't know how to get away from her grip. Then came the night that etched it all into my mind forever. It had been 3 weeks of this madness when I noticed something strange. Helen stopped coming over, stopped messaging. The absence was so sharp, I felt a strange sense of loss mingled with relief. Just when I thought things would settle, I discovered a letter slipped under my door. The paper was yellowed, creased, and unsealed. As I picked it up, a chill crawled down my spine. The letter was a confession, a disturbing tale of obsession. It detailed how she had watched my every movement, how she knew my routines better than I did myself. "You are mine," it said, "and I have been waiting for the right moment to bring us together." I dropped the letter as though it had burned my fingers and rushed to lock my door, my heart pounding like a drum in a symphony of terror. The paranoia swallowed me, taking root in my mind. What did she mean? Was she watching me right then? I found myself peering from the windows every time a shadow flickered in the hallway. Days later, I decided I could take no more. I made plans to move out. Even though I'd signed a lease, I needed to escape. But before I could pack my things, the apartment buzzed with an unnatural silence. I could feel it, the weight of being watched. While I frantically began to collect my belongings, the doorbell chimed again. I froze, knowing it had to be her. I crouched in the corner of my living room, waiting for the door to burst open, my heart pounding in my ears. In what felt like an eternity later, the echo of footsteps faded away. I waited until the sun dipped below the horizon before bolting for the door. I heard whispers back in the hall, her voice sweet and dripping with malice, "You can't leave me, not now." I finally let my fear propel me. I fled, bag over my shoulder, heart racing as I sprinted to my car. All the lights felt like they were glaring, headlights blurring on the road. I hit the gas and didn't look back. But it didn't end there. Months have passed, and I think I've managed to start over. Yet, even now, in this new place, I sometimes catch myself looking over my shoulder, expecting Helen to pop up in the alleyway or at the grocery store. I keep my doors locked and my curtains drawn tight. I share this story not for sympathy but as a warning. Please, learn from my mistakes. Establish your boundaries firmly and without hesitation. You never know who might be waiting to cross them, ready to invade the sacred space that should belong only to you. It's vital to defend your boundaries, for they are the walls that protect you from those who may never understand the word no. My story doesn't end here, it's a lesson wrapped in fear, echoing in my mind every single day. Respect your space, because there are people out there who think they know better. Boundaries are not walls, they are gates that keep out the chaos and the madness creeping ever closer. Do not let them in. I never considered myself a bad communicator, but when my girlfriend Lily ended things, reality hit me harder than a punch to the gut. I thought we had it all figured out, but clearly, something wasn't clicking. It wasn't until she packed her things and walked out the door, leaving me with the stinging words "you just never listen" echoing in my mind, that I realized I had to make an effort to change. I stumbled through the initial days of our breakup, drowning my sorrows in binge-watching shows and lofty delusions of winning her back with grand gestures. But as the shock wore off, a twisted curiosity about my failures crept in. I started obsessively retracing our conversations. Texts, late-night talks, all those moments when I thought I was there for her but apparently wasn't. I noticed a pattern. When she opened up, I responded with platitudes or worse, tried to offer solutions instead of listening. It was as if I heard her but didn't really hear her. One night, deep in my rabbit hole of self-reflection, I came across a forum post on an obscure website, titled "How I Learned to Communicate with the Dead." At first, I dismissed it as another incredible hoax, but my morbid curiosity got the better of me. It described a mystical experience involving a one-of-a-kind seance led by a woman named Agnes, who claimed to connect you not just with the deceased but deeper aspects of yourself. It quickly became my obsession. After hours of searching, I found her old shop tucked away in an alley at the edge of town. I hesitated, an uneasy feeling washing over me as I approached the creaky door. Inside, the dim light flickered ominously, and the air was heavy with incense. Agnes was an elderly woman, with wild white hair and piercing blue eyes that seemed to look right through me. "You're here for answers," she stated, almost like a revelation. I nodded, feeling foolish yet strangely compelled by her presence. As she prepared for the séance, she filled the room with an eerie calmness that lulled my anxiety. The candles flickered more with each moment, and the air thickened, almost buzzing with anticipation. "To communicate better, we need to quiet the noise within you." She instructed me to focus on my breath, to strip away the clutter of my thoughts, emotions, and insecurities. I closed my eyes and tried. It was a strange mix of calming and chaos, the constant chatter of self-doubt warring against her voice like an undefeated champion. When I opened my eyes again, I saw the candles flickering wildly, shadows dancing wildly across the walls. Agnes held my gaze, and that's when I felt it, a rush of memories, voices, and emotions flooding my mind. The spirit, she said, represented all those moments I had swept aside. It wasn't a ghost in the traditional sense, but a manifestation of my regrets. Around midnight, I felt as if I had transcended time, hanging on to every single word whispered from the echoes of past arguments with Lily, her voice ringing crystal clear in my mind. I felt her pain, her frustration at my indifference. I was reliving every moment I had neglected her feelings. The weight of it all hit me like a freight train, and I found myself pleading out loud, "I'm sorry, I didn't mean to hurt you. Why didn't I see it? But Agnes simply smiled knowingly, her gaze unwavering. You can't change the past, but you can learn from it. Open your heart and mind to others. When the séance ended, and I stumbled out of the shop, the world seemed different. Colors were brighter, sounds were sharper. In that disorienting moment, I realized communication wasn't about the words themselves, it was about truly listening and understanding the emotions behind them. The next day, I sent Lily a text, a simple message asking if she would be open to talking. Surprisingly, she replied almost immediately. We agreed to meet at our favorite cafe, a place filled with bittersweet memories. My palms were sweaty as I sat down with my coffee, the aroma filling my senses. When she arrived, we exchanged tentative smiles. I had rehearsed what to say 1,000 times over, but all that planning felt unnecessary now that I was faced with her. I started by apologizing, not just for the breakup, but for the times I hadn't listened. To my amazement, her eyes softened, she shared her perspective on everything, and I listened. It felt as if I was hearing her for the first time. As our conversation flowed, I realized that she was still the same, but I had changed. I asked her to tell me about her day, her feelings, even her dreams, all the things I had pushed aside in the past. For the first time, I focused solely on her words, absorbing the emotions behind them. It was awkward and difficult at times because trusting each other again felt like a fragile dance. But as we talked, I began to understand the nuances of communication, the subtleties of patience and empathy. When our conversation came to an end, I was left in awe of the progress we made in just one meeting. We didn't rush back into a relationship, but we established a foundation of understanding that hadn't been there before. I realized truly listening was just as important as talking. That night, I reflected on the experience, how a séance had shown me the ghosts of my actions. It wasn't the supernatural that had changed me, it was the realization of my shortcomings. Days turned into weeks, and Lily and I started to rebuild our connection slowly. There were still bumps along the way, misunderstandings that popped up from time to time, but now, instead of deflecting or dodging them, we faced each issue head-on. Each conversation built more trust, we laughed together, cried together, and, most importantly, we learned how to communicate. I embraced that vulnerability, and it became natural to probe deeper, ask more questions, and show genuine interest in her feelings. I learned not to see silence as an enemy to fill with chatter, but as an opportunity to reflect or understand. Months passed, and one evening on a back porch, while watching the sun dip below the horizon, I turned to Lily and said, I'm grateful for everything, even the tough times. They made me better. She smiled at me softly, those eyes sparkling with a knowing light as she replied, I think we both learned a lot, didn't we? And in that moment, I understood that communication was an ongoing journey, not a destination. It was about empathy, listening, and really valuing what each partner brought to the relationship. I never did see Agnes again, but her words lingered, a soft reminder of how I learned to communicate better in my relationships without the need for spirits or seance. There's a ghost of sorts in every relationship, it's just up to us to confront them. I want to share with you an experience that changed my life forever, one I hesitated to relive until the need to tell someone became overwhelming. It began innocently enough, a week off from work, and my friends had canceled on me last minute. Instead of wallowing in disappointment, I decided to go on a trip alone. Initially, I felt nervous, traveling solo through uncharted territories was not something I had ever envisioned. So, I packed a small backpack, tossed in a couple of changes of clothes, and set out to the quaint coastal town of Greyhaven. The plan was to spend a few days at a charming little inn, exploring the town, enjoying the scenery, and perhaps finding some comfort in solitude. My arrival at Greyhaven was enveloped in a silence I had never experienced, the ocean breeze whispering gentle secrets as I stepped off the bus. I checked into the inn, a creaky wooden building filled with a sense of history. The innkeeper, a sweet elderly woman named Agnes, greeted me with a warm smile, her hands weathered yet gentle as she handed me the keys to my room. It was a small, cozy space with a window overlooking the ocean, its gentle waves rolling onto the sandy shore. I immediately felt the burden of my recent weeks gradually lifting, the chaos of my life replaced by an unexpected peace. After settling in, I decided to venture out and see what the town had to offer. As I walked through the cobbled streets, I was entranced by the warmth of the locals. They smiled and nodded as I passed, making me feel like I was stepping into a warm embrace. There was a vibrant art shop, a quaint cafe filled with the aroma of freshly baked pastries, and small vendors selling handmade trinkets. Hours slipped away as I wandered, each moment a celebration of solitude. Dinner was a delightful affair. I chose a little seafood joint tucked away from the bustling streets. I sat alone at the bar, savoring every bite of the lobster ravioli as the sun set, painting the sky in hues of orange and lavender. It was serene, just me and the luscious food. I returned to my inn, an airy buzz scuttling through my heart. The feeling was intoxicating. That night, however, things took a strange turn. As I was drifting off to sleep, I heard the distinct sound of whispering. It was faint at first, like a breeze rustling through leaves. Confused, I shook it off as the wind outside playing tricks on my ears and fell deeper into a restful slumber. The next day, I woke up early to watch the sunrise, a colossal amber ball rising over the horizon, fragments of light dancing upon the water. The beauty of it all pulled me in like gravity. I had never felt so connected to a moment before. Nevertheless, the whispering returned that night, louder this time, clearer. Fragments of words wafted through the air, barely audible yet tangible enough to send shivers down my spine. Curiosity gnawed at me, compelling me to seek the source. My gut told me to keep quiet, to ignore it, but the mystery of it churned in my mind. On my third day, I discovered a small hidden path leading down to an isolated beach, only accessible during low tide. It was secluded, the support of the cliffs creating an almost sacred atmosphere. I found myself drawn deeper into this world, where the sea met the rocks, and the whispers became waves of sound echoing through my mind. I wandered back to the inn, the whispers still ringing. It felt as if there was something waiting for me, calling my name from within the shadows. As evening fell, I steeled myself against the growing chill and went back to the beach. The moon was full, casting eerie silver beams across the water, illuminating the beach like a stage in a ghostly play. The whispers grew louder, now almost like a chorus. There, standing at the water's edge, was a figure, a silhouette watching the waves. The figure was draped in flowing white, blending seamlessly with the soft froth of the crashing ocean. I couldn't move. I was frozen, caught between the impulse to flee and the desire to understand the enigma before me. Gathering my courage, I called out, and the figure turned. Her face was ethereal, a haunting beauty illuminated by the celestial glow, and with her eyes, she beckoned me closer. An inexplicable bond seemed to form, an understanding transcending words. She opened her mouth, and the sweet sound of laughter danced through the air, coaxing me to step closer. In that moment, I felt a rush of emotions, elation, fear, and an uncanny sense of familiarity. I approached cautiously and realized she wore a necklace of sea stones, each one glinting with the soft shimmer of moonlight. She reached out, and suddenly, the whispers morphed into a gentle hum, wrapping around us like a warm blanket. "You've come searching for something," she said, her voice melodic yet firm. "You were meant to find it here." I didn't understand, but a part of me knew she was right. Alone with her on that mystical beach, I felt happier than I'd ever felt before. And just as suddenly, she stepped back, melting into the shadows, her laughter echoing in the wind. That night, I lay awake, the events swirling in my mind. The next morning dawned bright and clear, yet she was gone, leaving behind mere memories. With that vanishing act came a realization: the joy of traveling alone lay in the authenticity of my solitude, the ability to confront my deepest fears and embrace the unknown. It was the beginning of a journey within myself. I returned to city life after a week in Greyhaven, an invigorated version of myself. The whispers became invitations, the solitude became a friend. I learned to wander parts of my existence that were untouched, allowing me to connect with my truest self. Traveling alone taught me that the most profound journeys don't always lead to new destinations. Instead, they often remind us of the vastness within. Every trip I take now is marked by the lessons learned during that magical week. So, if you're reading this, and feeling hesitant about a solo adventure, let me tell you, don't think twice. Step into the unknown, embrace the silence, for it is there you might just discover who you truly are. When I tried meditation for the first time, a transformative experience. I had always heard about the benefits of meditation, how it could help clear your mind and bring peace, but I never really believed it. My life was filled with deadlines, work stress, and the usual chaos that came with being an adult. One night, after yet another exhausting day, I found myself scrolling through Reddit in search of something, anything, to help me unwind. That's when I stumbled upon a subreddit dedicated to meditation. The testimonials were glowing, people claimed it changed their lives. With a hint of skepticism but desperate for relief, I decided to give it a shot. So, I put on some comfortable clothes, dimmed the lights, and found a quiet spot in my small apartment. I had no idea what I was doing but figured I could at least sit still and breathe. I set an alarm for 20 minutes, closed my eyes, and tried to focus on my breath. To be honest, the first few minutes felt awkward and a little ridiculous. I could hear every creak of the floorboards and the distant sounds of the city outside. I kept thinking about work, about that report I hadn't finished, and how I needed to grocery shop tomorrow. It felt like I was trying to catch smoke with my bare hands. Every time I grabbed onto a thought, it slipped away like it was never there to begin with. I was about to give up when I suddenly realized there was a deep rumble coming from somewhere around me. It sent a chill down my spine, but also ignited a flicker of curiosity. Tentatively, I tried to incorporate it into my meditation. I focused on the sound, the vibrations enveloping me like a warm blanket. Slowly, it morphed into something else, something almost melodic, and I found myself sinking deeper into the experience. The world around me began to dissolve, as if the walls of my apartment were made of mist. I don't know how long I had been in that space when I felt a presence behind me. My heart raced as I tried to maintain my composure. Was it a ghost? Had I finally gone too far into the realms of meditation? I dared a peek over my shoulder, and the moment I did, everything changed. I was standing in an enormous forest shrouded in a heavy fog. The trees were ancient and gnarled, their branches twisting into the sky like pleading hands. The hum I had felt earlier pulsed through this place, and for a moment, I felt no fear. Instead, a profound sense of connection washed over me. I stepped forward, my bare feet sinking into the cool, moist earth. As I wandered deeper, the sounds of the city faded completely. There were whispers in the air, a chorus of voices that seemed to be both inviting and warning me at the same time. Just as I thought I understood their murmurs, a figure emerged from the fog. At first glance, they seemed like a woman, though not entirely human. Her skin shimmered with an iridescent hue, and her eyes glowed softly, drawing me in like a moth to a flame. "You've come seeking peace," she said, her voice lilting and echoing. It felt like she was speaking directly into my mind rather than through the air. "But peace has a price." I froze, the gravity of her words sinking in. I had left behind my chaotic life in search of calm, yet here was a being who existed beyond my comprehension, telling me there were consequences to my desires. "What do you mean?" I managed to ask, dread pooling at my feet. "Every doorway opened must be walked through, and every meditative state reveals truth." Her gaze pinned me in place. "Do you wish to see?" Against my better judgment, I nodded. In an instant, the forest twisted and warped, colors bleeding into one another. I was shown glimpses of my life, visions of loneliness, of moments where I had hurt others without meaning to, and the shadows of memories buried deep within. I was overwhelmed by sadness, guilt, and a raw vulnerability I had hidden even from myself. I fell to my knees in despair, feeling entirely exposed. "This is the price of peace," she said gently, "the truth lay bare. Only by facing it can you find true tranquility." I felt a weight lift from my chest, but it was soon replaced by a heavier sorrow. "I don't want to feel this," I cried out, my spirit breaking. I just wanted relief. A soft chuckle echoed around me. "Relief comes in many forms. When you confront that which burdens you, only then can you find balance." In that surreal moment, I realized the truth couldn't simply be pushed away or ignored. I had been living in a fog of my own making, suppressing my emotions, not wanting to deal with the impact of my actions. The trees around me began to glow, illuminating the shadows as if to say there was hope. I took a deep breath and began to understand that the pain I felt could be transformed into something powerful. As I absorbed this revelation, I felt the ground shift beneath me. I was pulled back through the forest, through colorful swirls that twisted and wrapped like ribbons of light until I stumbled back into my living room. My alarm buzzed, jarring me fully awake. I blinked, disoriented but changed. Everything was brighter. The weight I felt earlier did not vanish, but it transformed. It was now a call to action. I picked up a notebook that had been lying on my desk, and I began to write. I wrote about the shadows in my life, about the people I had hurt, the fears I had buried, and the need for forgiveness, not from them, but for myself. As I wrote, I felt lighter, as if I was releasing the tension with each stroke of my pen. The experience of meditation, the being in the forest, the ethereal woman, they all felt like echoes of a truth I was only beginning to unravel. It was the first time I truly understood that peace wasn't just about finding silence, it was about embracing the noise of our existence, confronting and accepting the parts of ourselves that may be hard to face. The next day, I reached out to those I had wronged, starting to mend fences where I thought there were none. I practiced meditation daily, each session unearthing a little more of the chaos within, and every time I faced it, I felt the fog clear just a bit more. I realized meditation wasn't just a practice, it was a journey. One that led me not only to tranquility but also to the strength buried deep within, a transformative experience that went far beyond any simple search for peace. I stumbled upon an old journal yesterday that belonged to my childhood best friend, Sarah. It's been over a decade since I last saw her, and flipping through those yellowed pages unlocked something I thought I had buried deep, a mix of nostalgia and sorrow that overwhelmed me. Sarah and I had been inseparable ever since kindergarten, sharing secrets like they were candy, whispering dreams of the future under the starlit sky, and getting into all sorts of innocent mischief. Our bond was a tapestry woven with laughter and late-night adventures until one fateful day when she just vanished. No warning, no goodbye. One day, she was there, and the next, it was like she had evaporated. Her family had moved away overnight, and it was years before I finally learned they had left town in a hurry. I remember the endless summer of searching, the vacant spaces in my heart as I held onto her fading memory. Thankfully, we had our journal, our shared chronicle of friendship. As a kid, Sarah and I would fill its pages with drawings, doodled notes, funny stories, and even the occasional big secret we swore to keep forever. Flipping through it yesterday was like being open to a time capsule, each entry flung me back into our innocent past. There was a note where she wrote about a tree in her backyard, our secret meeting spot where we would retreat from the world. A line in her shaky handwriting caught my eye: "If we ever get lost, let's meet here. I can hear our laughter from far away." It hit me like a stone to the chest, her laughter echoing in memories long silenced. I held on to the journal tightly as if it were my last link to her, a lifeline tossed into turbulent waters. I could feel a yearning in my chest, an overwhelming need to track her down, to find her again. But where do you search for someone who seemingly disappeared? After hours of research, a flicker, a single thread of hope. I discovered an online presence. She had left footprints in the digital world. Sarah had a social media account, and there was even a recent post featuring her smiling, standing beneath a familiar tree. It was the exact tree from our journal. The post looked recent. It was a picture of her beaming in the sunlight, a band of vibrant flowers across her hair. My heart raced. She was alive and well. I couldn't believe it. I sent her a message, pouring out my heart about all the memories we shared, the friendship that was abandoned but never forgotten, my hope for a reunion. Hours passed, and just as I was about to lose hope, my phone buzzed with a notification. It was her. "I've missed you," it read, along with an invitation to meet at the old tree. My heart pounded fiercely. It felt surreal, like phantoms of the past had materialized. I drove to that neighborhood, arriving back at the place that held so many threads of our childhood tapestry. The sun was beginning to set, draping everything in a warm, golden hue. I walked toward the tree, a giant oak that stood like a sentinel amidst the encroaching darkness. I stood there, my heart racing, filled with anticipation and anxiety. Would she recognize me? What if she has changed too much? My thoughts were interrupted by laughter, her laughter. It flowed through the air, lifting my spirits instantly. It was unmistakably Sarah. I turned and saw her, older but vividly the same, a piece of my past come to life. The moment our eyes locked, everything else faded. It felt like a time warp, as if the years disappeared. All that was left was the joy and love that bound us. She rushed towards me, and we embraced so tightly that it was like we were trying to fuse our two souls back into one. She was real, tangible, and more beautiful than my memories ever dared to suggest. We spent hours recounting stories and filling each other in on the lost years, the highs, and the lows. She explained why her family had left so abruptly, a sudden job transfer, a domestic upheaval, things she kept secret, trying to shield me from the pain. Time flowed like a river, sometimes gentle, sometimes roaring. And just as happiness enveloped us like a warm blanket, she shared something that shattered that momentary bliss. She had been living with a terminal illness for the past few years. It was devastating. After hearing her story, I felt torn, helpless. I had spent so much time searching for her only to discover shadowy clouds hanging over her life. I wanted to scream that it wasn't fair, that she shouldn't have to endure this. But we couldn't dwell on the darkness for long. Instead, we embraced every moment, every laugh, every nostalgic secret. As daylight signaled it was time to part ways, we promised to keep in touch, to be present in each other's lives once more, no matter the circumstances. Walking away from that tree, I felt an odd mixture of hope and heartache blooming within me. We had reconnected in a way that felt almost divine, but I also felt the clock ticking down, an ominous reminder of her fragile condition. That night, I lay in bed, unable to shake the feeling of how lucky I was, and so scared. I didn't sleep much, consumed by thoughts of my friend who so bravely faced her mortality. Over the next few weeks, we met frequently, sharing moments that felt transcendent against the weight of reality. Each time we parted, my heart sank knowing she was fighting a battle so fierce. But then one evening, something unbelievable happened. I received a call from her mother. A panic gripped me as I answered. "She wants to see you," were the first words that nearly knocked the breath out of me. I rushed to her house, nearly shaking with anxiety as I knocked on the door. Her mother led me to the living room, a somber expression on her face. Sarah was there, propped up in bed, a fragile shadow of the vibrant friend I once knew. I held her hand, and we spent what felt like mere moments talking. "There's something I want to share with you," she said, her voice barely a whisper but filled with conviction. Before we lost touch, I wrote something I never got to say. It was then she revealed the journal I had found, a testament to years of friendship and dreams. Tears slipped down my cheeks as I listened to her words, long unspoken feelings that were raw and real. It struck me, this powerful bond we shared knew no boundaries, not even time or sickness. And so we vowed, as the days grew shorter and the nights emerged with uncertainty, to cherish each moment left, to be a source of comfort and strength for one another. The last page of her journal remained blank for a reason, and when the time came for her final rest, I took it upon myself to fill it with everything she had meant to me, every cherished memory and every love-filled line, ensuring she would carry with her the warmth of our friendship always. I felt as if we had traveled through time, binding the threads of our lives with every shared smile and tear. It was a heartwarming reunion that transcended mere chance. It was the universe reminding me that some souls never truly part ways. Even in the face of adversity, our friendship endured like the roots of that ancient oak, deep and unwavering, a testament that love could both heal and endure all. As I sat there beside her, I realized that some friendships, like the tree in the backyard, stay anchored in time, forever part of who we are, intertwined with the narratives of our lives. And even if that thread seemed fine, frail under the weight of reality, it would remain, like fireflies lighting the darkness of the night, illuminating, guiding, and reminding us of what truly matters in life. Aita for telling my sister her fiancé is a gold digger. I never thought I would find myself in the middle of a family feud, but here we are, and it all started with my sister's engagement. Ever since Mia got together with Jake, things have felt off. Jake is charming, handsome, and has this magnetic personality that draws people in, but something about him always felt disingenuous to me. I couldn't quite put my finger on it at first, but the more I observed their relationship, the more concerned I became. Mia has always been the type to wear her heart on her sleeve, and when she fell for Jake, she fell hard. She talked about him nonstop, showering him with love and admiration, and while I wanted to be happy for her, I couldn't shake the feeling that Jake was more interested in her money than in her. After a few months of watching their relationship unfold, I started to notice some troubling patterns. Jake would casually mention his financial struggles, how he was between jobs and how much he admired Mia's successful career as a graphic designer. At first, I tried to dismiss it as just a normal relationship, but then I heard him making comments about how Mia should treat them to nice dinners and vacations, which made my skin crawl. I had a feeling that he was living off her kindness and generosity, and it broke my heart to think that my sister might be getting taken advantage of. As time went on, I voiced my concerns to my parents, hoping they would see what I saw. But they shrugged it off, telling me I was just being protective and that I should give Jake a chance. I felt like I was screaming into a void, and my frustration only grew as Mia started planning their wedding. I was expected to stand by her side as a supportive sister, but I couldn't shake the feeling of dread. The more excited she became about the wedding, the more I feared what it would mean for her future. Finally, the day came when I could no longer hold my tongue. We were at a family dinner when Mia mentioned how much she loved Jake and couldn't wait to spend the rest of her life with him. I could feel my heart racing, and I knew I had to say something. I took a deep breath and blurted it out, "Mia, I think you should be careful. I really think Jake is a gold digger." The room fell silent, and the tension was palpable. Mia's face turned from joy to confusion, then to anger. "What are you talking about? How can you say that about him?" she yelled, her voice rising with each word. My heart sank as I realized I had opened a Pandora's box. "I'm just looking out for you. He's always talking about money and never seems to be contributing anything. Can't you see that?" I replied, desperation creeping into my voice. The argument escalated quickly, and before I knew it, my parents were trying to mediate, but Mia was having none of it. "You don't know him like I do. You're just jealous because I'm happy," she screamed, and I felt the sting of her words cut deep. The dinner ended in chaos, and I left feeling like a villain in my own family. Over the next few weeks, things between Mia and me became increasingly strained. She refused to talk to me, and when we did interact, it was icy and filled with resentment. I started to question my decision. Was I really being a protective sister, or was I just meddling in her life? I tried to reach out, to apologize for how things had escalated, but she wouldn't have it. Jake even got involved, sending me a text that read, "Stay out of my relationship." I felt like I was stuck in a nightmare, losing my sister to someone I believed was bad for her. Then one night, everything changed. I was scrolling through social media, looking for a distraction, when I stumbled upon a post on a local news site. It was a story about a couple who had recently become victims of a fraud scheme, and the man involved had a striking resemblance to Jake. My heart raced as I read the details. This man had been preying on women for their money, charming them into trusting him before vanishing with their savings. I immediately sent the article to Mia, hoping it would open her eyes. But instead of seeing it as a warning, she flew into a rage. "You're pathetic. You're just trying to ruin my life," she yelled over the phone. I felt crushed. All I wanted was to protect her. The weeks turned into months, and the rift between us grew. I was a stranger to my sister, and it hurt more than I could express. Then one fateful evening, I received a frantic call from my mom. "You need to come over now. Mia is upset, and I think Jake is about to leave her." My heart raced as I rushed over to their apartment. When I arrived, I found Mia sitting on the floor, tears streaming down her face. Jake was pacing around the room, clearly agitated. "I don't want to do this anymore," he yelled, throwing his hands in the air. "You're just not the person I thought you were." I felt a flicker of hope, thinking maybe she would see the truth about him, but as I approached, I could see Mia was more hurt than ever. "What are you talking about? I thought we were happy," she cried, and I could feel the weight of the world pressing down on her. Jake turned to me, his expression a mix of anger and disdain. "You're the one who's caused all this. You poisoned her mind against me." It felt surreal, like I was watching a train wreck in slow motion. I opened my mouth to defend myself, but Mia cut me off. "You need to leave. I can't deal with this right now." My heart shattered as I stepped back, feeling utterly defeated. Jake stormed out, leaving Mia sobbing on the floor. I rushed to her side, wrapping my arms around her. "I'm so sorry, Mia. I just wanted to protect you," I whispered, my heart aching for her pain. She pulled away, her eyes filled with hurt and confusion. "I don't know who to believe anymore," she said, her voice trembling. In that moment, I realized that no matter how much I wanted to help, I couldn't force her to see the truth. It was her life, her choice, and all I could do was be there for her, no matter the cost. As we sat there together, I made a silent promise to myself. I would support her, but I would never stop looking out for her. It wasn't about being right, it was about being there for her when she needed me most. In the days that followed, things began to shift. Mia took time to reevaluate her relationship with Jake, and slowly, the walls between us started to come down. I realized that being a protective sister didn't mean I had to control her choices, it meant being there to catch her when she fell. Sometimes, love meant letting go and trusting someone to find their way. Even if it hurt, I knew I would always be there for her, no matter what. I witnessed a crazy proposal, here's the drama that unfolded. I witnessed a crazy proposal, here's the drama that unfolded. It all started innocently enough, just another weekend dinner out with my friends at this new trendy rooftop restaurant that had just opened downtown. The place had been buzzing with people ever since it opened, with a stunning view of the skyline, live music, and a relaxed but chic vibe that just made you feel like you were a part of something special. We managed to snag a reservation on the terrace, right by the railing where you could see the city lights spread out for miles, and I was just settling into my chair when I noticed a group at the table beside us. They seemed like a fun bunch at first, and I couldn't help but notice one guy in particular who kept glancing at this woman across from him with a sort of anxious but excited expression. You know the look, like he was building up to something big. And that's when I realized, with a thrill of second-hand excitement, that this guy was probably about to propose. My friends noticed it too, and we exchanged looks, giggling quietly and half pretending not to watch as he started to reach under the table, fumbling around like he was searching for something. We all knew what was coming, or at least, we thought we did. The whole terrace seemed to hold its breath as he finally pulled out this small, black velvet box, took a deep, shaky breath, and got down on one knee. The girl gasped, her hands flying to her mouth, and for a split second, it was like we were all suspended in this magical, movie-perfect moment. But then, just as he opened the box and said her name, this other woman, sitting at a nearby table, let out this strangled, almost guttural scream. Heads turned, including the girl who was just about to be proposed to, her face shifting from surprised delight to sheer horror as she looked at this other woman. And before any of us could figure out what was going on, the woman had stormed up to them, pointing a shaking finger at the guy on his knee and yelling, "What the hell are you doing, Brandon? Who is this?" A collective gasp went through the terrace as Brandon's face went white, and he stumbled back to his feet, looking like he'd just seen a ghost. His would-be fiancée looked utterly lost, her smile melting away, and she turned to Brandon, whispering, "Brandon, who is she?" It was then that we all started to piece it together. The woman who had interrupted was his girlfriend, his actual girlfriend, and apparently, he'd been secretly seeing this other girl on the side. The way she screamed at him, her voice shaking with betrayal and rage, made it clear she had no idea he'd been leading a double life. By this point, the whole restaurant was watching, the music had stopped, and every eye was locked onto this unfolding nightmare. Brandon, caught between two women, seemed completely paralyzed, like a deer in headlights, mumbling something about how he'd meant to break it off, but hadn't gotten around to it. The girl he'd just proposed to looked like her whole world had just shattered. She kept whispering, "Is this true?" over and over, almost to herself, while the other woman, his actual girlfriend, stood there with this fierce look of betrayal, demanding answers. And then, just when we thought it couldn't get any crazier, the girlfriend reached over, grabbed the ring out of the box, and hurled it over the railing with this furious scream. The ring flew through the air, a little glint of silver against the night sky, and we all watched as it plummeted down into the street below, disappearing from sight. That's when the yelling started in earnest. The girl who had just been proposed to began sobbing, tears streaming down her face, and she demanded that Brandon tell her why he would do this, why he would go so far as to propose while leading this double life. Brandon looked utterly defeated, his eyes darting around as if searching for an escape route, but his girlfriend wasn't letting him off the hook. She kept pressing him, her voice breaking as she told him she'd thought he was the one, that they'd been planning a life together. Her voice cracked as she asked him why he would betray her like this, especially in such a public, humiliating way. People around us were murmuring, some gasping, others pulling out their phones to record the whole thing, whispering in shock about how they'd never seen anything like it. But the heartbreak and raw emotion pouring out of these three people, right in the middle of this glamorous rooftop restaurant, was something that no camera could fully capture. At one point, the girl he'd proposed to let out this strangled laugh, wiping her tears and saying, "I thought you were the love of my life. I thought this was the happiest day of my life." The other woman scoffed, crossing her arms and saying, "Join the club." It was brutal, the way they both seemed to turn on him, united in their hurt and betrayal, while Brandon stood there, completely silent, looking like he wanted to melt into the floor. The girl he'd proposed to finally turned on her heel, storming out of the restaurant with tears streaming down her face. As she left, the entire terrace erupted in shocked whispers, a low buzz of disbelief and fascination as people tried to process what they'd just witnessed. But the drama wasn't over yet. The girlfriend, who was still standing there, shot Brandon one last look of disgust and told him she never wanted to see him again, then turned and walked away, leaving him alone in front of the crowd that had witnessed his entire life fall apart in a matter of minutes. Brandon just stood there, staring at the spot where both women had disappeared, looking like he couldn't quite believe what had just happened. The restaurant staff were staring, some looking embarrassed, others looking like they couldn't wait to gossip about this later. The rest of us, myself included, felt like we'd just been part of some twisted, real-life soap opera that no one had seen coming. I remember looking around, seeing all the shocked faces, the quiet murmurs as people tried to wrap their heads around the betrayal, the heartbreak, and the sheer audacity of what Brandon had tried to pull off. It was the kind of thing you hear about in stories, but to see it play out right in front of us was something else entirely. As Brandon finally slinked away, leaving the restaurant with his head hanging low, the staff quickly tried to get the music back on, to reset the mood, but the energy was all wrong. My friends and I couldn't stop talking about it the rest of the night, dissecting every look, every word, replaying the shocking moment when that ring had flown over the edge. It was a proposal gone wrong in the worst possible way, and even now, thinking back on it, I'm still in disbelief that we got to witness the drama unfold so unexpectedly. The crazy part. We didn't even get our food yet when all of this went down, but by the time our appetizers arrived, we were too caught up in the gossip to even care. I'd like to share a story that still haunts me. I suppose that's what happens when you gain insight from a difficult experience. Sometimes the lesson comes with a price. This all took place last fall, just as the leaves were starting to fall and nights grew colder. I was in a pretty dark place, struggling with a breakup that left me feeling hollow, like a once vibrant tree stripped bare of life. I decided to take some time off from work and went to stay with my grandparents in their isolated cottage deep in the woods. They had this old place that always felt like stepping into a sepia-toned photograph, a simpler time, I guess. It had no cell phone reception, and the nearest town was 5 miles away. Everything there was quiet and still, a perfect escape from my chaotic mind. One evening, after a long day of wandering through those lovely, twisting forest trails, I noticed something odd while I was walking back home. It was just getting dark, and the shadows seemed to stretch out farther than they should. I glimpsed at it throughout the woods, peeking between the trees, a dim light that flickered. Naturally, curiosity got the better of me. I followed it, half expecting to find a fire pit and some campers or something, but when I reached the source, what I found instead was truly unsettling. It was a clearing with an old wooden table, weathered and half-rotten, illuminated by the eerie glow of a lantern swaying on its own. It was like something out of a horror movie. The air around me felt charged, thick with anticipation. The simplest thought crossed my mind, this could be dangerous. But if I didn't explore, I'd spend the rest of my time wondering. So, I stepped into the clearing. As soon as my foot crossed the threshold, the light in the lantern flickered violently, and I could swear I heard whispers carried on the wind, incoherent yet urgent. I tried to shake off the feeling of dread, telling myself it had to be my imagination rebelling against the tortilla of silence that surrounded me. I walked closer, peering at the table. That's when I noticed it was covered in strange objects, old trinkets, faded photographs, and books with pages torn out. There was something else, too, something I couldn't quite put my finger on, a scent of decay. As I leaned in, I became aware of an ancient tome sitting prominently atop the table, its pages curled and its edges frayed. It had a title embossed in gold, nearly illegible, The Timekeeper's Diary. Against my better judgment, I picked it up. I flipped through the pages, which were filled with incomprehensible symbols and hurried writing. Scrawled throughout the margins were notations that hinted at time travel, alternate realities, and a self-proclaimed consequence-free way to live, one where every choice leads to a branching pathway on the timeline. It was bizarre, but something about it resonated deeply with my mindset. The writing was frantic, almost pleading, as if the author was attempting to warn the reader against the dangers of tampering with fate and time. Suddenly, the lantern flickered again, and I felt the air grow heavier around me. The whispers transformed into urgent voices, shouting warnings I couldn't understand. Heart racing, I slammed the book shut, but not before the last line etched itself into my memory, choose wisely, each path bears its weight. I knew I should have thrown the book down and run. But instead, I felt drawn to it, like it was somehow tethering my thoughts to an alternate version of myself that was lost in an infinite loop. I rushed back home, my hands trembling. I locked myself in the cottage and spent the night awake, replaying everything in my head. By morning, the events from the night before felt like a fever dream. I shook it off and spent days trying to ignore it, but I couldn't rid myself of the thought of that book. It gnawed at my insides, taunted me in my dreams. After a week, I gave in, convinced that if I truly held the power to alter my destiny, I needed to see if it could fix my present turmoil. I simply wanted to feel happy again, even if it meant risking the unknown. That night, I returned to the clearing determined to find answers. The lantern flickered back to life as I stepped in, this time revealing a swirling mist that enveloped me. I opened the book with trembling hands. Every page burned with potential because the moment I read words aloud, I felt a rush of energy pulse through my body. I felt it tugging at the very fabric of my being, pulling me beneath the surface of existence. I envisioned a timeline where my ex loved me back, an alternate reality where I never felt the pain of rejection. Almost instantly, the world spun around me in dizzying colors, and then, darkness. When I awoke, I was still standing in the clearing, the book in my hands, but everything felt different. I was panting as if I had run a marathon. When I returned home, the first thing I noticed was the sound, a cacophony of laughter drifting through the air. My grandparents, who usually kept to themselves, were hosting a gathering. I stepped inside, heart pounding with anticipation, only to find my ex at the center of it all, laughing and smiling as if we had never broken up at all. I should have been thrilled, but a creeping dread slithered through my veins. Everything felt too perfect. As the evening wore on, the uneasy feeling in my stomach intensified. I watched them interact, and something horrified me. His laughs were too forced, their interactions too choreographed. I raised a glass to congratulate them, but my stomach twisted at the sight of him kissing my grandmother's cheek, and worse, his eyes darting around the room with a glint of knowing that chilled me to the core. I realized I wasn't in some joyful alternate universe, I was in a nightmare of my own making. I rushed back to the woods, the memory of that old tome pushing me forward. I needed to undo it. The moment I reached the clearing, panic set in. The lantern barely flickered to life, casting sinister shadows around the clearing. I frantically flipped through the pages of the diary, desperately searching for a solution. Yet the more I read, the more I understood that I had unleashed something awful, something that couldn't be easily undone. The consequences of my choice twisted in front of me. I had only seen potential happiness but ignored the weight that came with it. My heart sank as I realized the warnings in the diary were there for a reason. I was merely a conduit for something that could not be controlled. Each pathway held its darkness, each choice bore its consequence. The voices returned, louder now, swirling through my mind like a storm. I had been gifted the power to choose, but I had failed to recognize what I put at stake. I dropped the tome, letting it fall into the dirt. I felt the world shift again, faster this time. I couldn't hold on. Everything went black. I woke up back in my room, the first light of dawn creeping through the window, silent and still. I immediately felt weightless, as if the burden had been lifted. My eyes darted around, half expecting to see shadows lurking in the corners, but everything was normal. Yet something essential was lost. I had gained an insight, but at a cost I couldn't fully comprehend. My ex was gone from my life, but a part of me whispered that they had never truly been there at all. I knew then that I had to confront the reality of my experience, the pain, the heartbreak, everything I had tried to escape. The realization was brutal but freeing. I never returned to that place in the woods or picked up the diary again. I learned that sometimes difficult experiences strip us bare not just to haunt us but to help us grow. This was all about reclaiming my past and learning to let go of paths that never existed. There's a scar that remains from that time, but it has shaped who I am now, who I continue to become. Life is made up of choices, conscious or otherwise. Sometimes it's best to feel the weight of those choices instead of running from them. So, if you find yourself out in the woods one day and stumble upon an old table with a mysterious tome just like I did, think twice. Some choices are better left unexplored, truths better left unspoken. When I faced a major setback and bounced back, I had no idea how different my life was about to become. It all started with a simple email. I was a tech startup founder, and after years of hard work, we had finally secured funding for the project I believed would revolutionize the way people communicate. We were set to launch our app within a month. We had everything in place, a sharp team, a polished product, and a marketing strategy that was meant to skyrocket us into the tech stratosphere. I was confident, even cocky in the way that only an entrepreneur can be, until that fateful Wednesday morning. It was the same day I decided to check my email over coffee, something I usually do while half asleep, still in my pajamas. When that email notification pinged, I wouldn't have guessed it would change everything. I opened it to discover a message from my investor, my biggest backer, and what I found left me cold. The subject line read "regrettable decision," and my heart sank as I began to read. He claimed we'd make better use of the funds if we redirected our focus. After months of hard work, he had backed out entirely, claiming the tech landscape had changed too much in light of some larger competitors entering the space at the last minute. I couldn't believe it. We had meetings scheduled, a launch party booked, and suddenly, everything seemed to unravel. In sheer disbelief, I sat there staring at the screen, unmoving as the world outside continued spinning. The room felt like it was closing in on me, my heart pounding in my ears. Panic constricted my throat. I spent the next hours in a fog. I let it fester, this sense of impending doom. I tried to reach out for support, but each attempt felt increasingly futile. The people close to me didn't understand the tech world like I did, and my friends didn't know what to say when I dropped this bombshell on them. To make matters worse, the looming deadline felt like a noose tightening around my neck. It was like I was faced with a dark chasm, and I could see nothing but the bottomless pit of my shattered dreams. Days passed and nothing seemed to improve. I couldn't work, couldn't eat, couldn't sleep. My co-founders waited, anxiously monitoring my every move, but I felt like a skeleton of the person I used to be. Their concern was palpable. They wanted me to pick up the pieces, but how do you do that when every piece feels crushed into dust? One day, as I sat in silence in my cluttered apartment, a stray thought flickered in my mind. What if I simply walked away? What if I cut my losses and accepted defeat? I sat there long enough to really consider it, but suddenly I was hit with a wave of realization. Defeat wouldn't just mean surrendering the app, it would mean letting my team down, abandoning the little seedlings of hope that had taken root within our vision. I finally decided enough was enough. It was time to face the reality of the situation. I gathered my team, sat them down, and explained everything. It was tough, admitting my fears in that meeting. But then something peculiar happened. Instead of judging me, they rallied around me. They brought ideas to the table, all enthusiastic, ready to pivot our strategy and redefine our vision. We spent the next week brainstorming and reworking our plan, replacing our fears with innovation. Every sleepless night became an opportunity for creativity, and every setback became a stepping stone. By the end of it, we had not just rebranded our product, but we had also attracted the attention of other investors who were eager to jump on board. I felt a strange exhilaration that made my heart race, but this time, it was fuel for a fire that I had reignited. The world I had faced began to shift as we unveiled our new approach and found ourselves with more support than we had ever imagined possible. Each day pushed us further toward our launch. It was grueling work, yet invigorating at the same time. Every late night, every cancellation, and every stressful coffee-fueled meeting somehow brought us closer together. Finally, the moment arrived. The launch day felt surreal, the energy in the office crackled like static electricity. We pressed send, and my heart raced. The moment the app hit the market, the response was even better than our wildest dreams. Reviews poured in, and people were posting about us on every social media platform you could imagine. They loved it. They believed in it the way we had when it was just an idea. There we were, bouncing back from what could have ruined us, and not just surviving but thriving. 3 months later, I found myself in the office again, surrounded by my team, sipping celebratory champagne as we reflected on what had happened. The lingering sense of doom became a distant memory, replaced by a confidence that I thought I had lost for good. We had faced a monstrous setback and emerged victorious, but the experience left scars that still reminded me of how precarious success can be. As I looked around the room, I knew this was just the beginning. Adversity had forced us to harness our potential. We had learned to embrace failure, turning it into a launch pad rather than a noose. That morning toast felt like a living testament to our journey. I raised my glass, the warmth of gratitude washing over me as I smiled at my team, to bouncing back. What felt like a death knell had transformed into soaring wings, reminding me that facing the abyss sometimes leads you to a higher peak than you ever thought you could reach. The setback had only been a moment. How we responded to it was the real story. It was in that moment that I realized setbacks are merely setups for something greater, something deeper, defining moments that shape us in ways we can't yet understand. And as the echoes of our laughter filled the room, I finally accepted that failure is simply a reroute to success. My neighbor's secret life, I never expected this. My neighbor's secret life, I never expected this. From the moment I moved into the quiet suburb, my neighbor Joe was the last person I thought would ever become a point of intrigue. He was the picture of normality, middle-aged, graying hair, glasses that slipped down his nose, and a meticulously mowed lawn. His house was an immaculate, single-story, cookie-cutter suburban home with the classic white picket fence, and every morning at 7:30 sharp, he'd be out there watering his flowers with that same steady hand and blank expression. Over the months, we exchanged the typical small talk, occasional nods, and awkward neighborly smiles, but nothing beyond that. Joe seemed to live an ordinary, uneventful life, that is, until the night I heard the sounds. It was around midnight when I first noticed it, strange thuds coming from Joe's backyard, followed by what sounded like muffled voices. I told myself it was nothing, probably a raccoon or maybe Joe moving something heavy, but the sounds continued night after night. Curiosity ate at me. On the fifth night, I finally decided to peek through the gap in my curtains, catching a glimpse of Joe under the dim glow of his porch light. He was dragging something large and bulky across his backyard toward the shed. The figure looked human-sized, covered in what seemed like a thick black tarp. My heart pounded as I watched him struggle to get it through the shed door before disappearing inside. I didn't sleep that night, my mind spiraling with possibilities, trying to convince myself it was just an old rug or maybe some broken furniture, but deep down, I felt something was wrong. The next morning, I casually brought up the noise to Joe when I saw him outside, hoping he'd offer some mundane explanation, but he just smiled in that unsettlingly blank way and said, "Must be the wind." I brushed it off, trying to resume life as normal, but things only got stranger. Every night, around midnight, Joe would perform his ritual, dragging something new to the shed, sometimes covered in black tarp, other times in what looked like burlap sacks. I tried to convince myself he was just a quirky guy with weird habits, but then came the incident that pushed me over the edge. One night, unable to sleep, I stood by my bedroom window, watching his movements, when suddenly, his head jerked up. He looked directly at my window, like he knew I was there, even though I'd been standing in the dark. I quickly backed away, my heart racing, but the next morning, I found a handwritten note slipped under my door. "Some things are best left unseen." My hands shook as I read it. Was he threatening me? Warning me? I couldn't tell, but it sent a chill down my spine. I tried to avoid Joe after that, but every encounter felt heavier, his casual smiles masking something far more sinister. I considered calling the police, but I had no real evidence, just paranoia and a gut feeling. Then, one evening, I was walking past his house when I noticed something strange about his car. The trunk was slightly ajar, and from the gap, I could see a flash of what looked like dark stained fabric, and a heavy, metallic scent filled the air. I forced myself to keep walking, but every fiber of my being screamed that something was very, very wrong. Days passed, and I found myself obsessively watching his house. The shed became the center of my fixation. Why was he so secretive about it? Why only go there at night? Desperate for answers, I made a plan. Late one night, when the entire street was dark and silent, I snuck into his backyard, my pulse hammering in my ears. I crept toward the shed, trying the handle, but it was locked. Just as I was about to leave, I spotted a small, dusty window on the side. I peered through it, squinting to make out the shapes inside. My heart nearly stopped. The walls were covered in newspaper clippings, all detailing missing persons cases from the surrounding area, some dating back years. Pictures of smiling faces, red strings connecting them, and handwritten notes filled the space. And in the center of the shed was a chair, chains bolted to its arms and legs, stained with something dark. I staggered back, bile rising in my throat, my mind racing. I had to get out of there, to call the police, to do something. But just as I turned to leave, I froze. Joe was standing there, no more than a few feet away, his face illuminated by the dim moonlight. He didn't look surprised. In fact, he looked calm, as if he'd been expecting me all along. "Couldn't resist, could you?" he said, his voice as cold as ice. I stammered, trying to come up with an excuse, an apology, anything, but the words wouldn't come. He stepped closer, blocking my path to the gate, his eyes never leaving mine. "I warned you," he murmured, his voice barely above a whisper. Panic surged through me as I tried to push past him, but his grip was like iron, his hands cold and unyielding. I don't remember exactly how I broke free, only that I found myself stumbling back to my house, locking every door and window behind me. I stayed up all night, waiting for the knock on the door, for the sound of him breaking in, but it never came. The next day, I went to the police, desperate to report what I'd seen, but without concrete evidence. They were reluctant to believe me. They agreed to do a welfare check, but when they returned, they told me the shed was empty, no chair, no clippings, nothing. They looked at me like I was crazy, like I'd made the whole thing up. I couldn't believe it. Joe had cleared everything out in the span of a few hours, leaving no trace behind. In the days that followed, Joe acted as though nothing had happened. He'd wave to me from his yard, that same eerie smile plastered on his face, his eyes glinting with something I couldn't quite place. I started avoiding my own house, spending nights at friends' places, jumping at every creak and shadow. The paranoia became unbearable. One day, a small package arrived at my doorstep with no return address. Inside was a single newspaper clipping, detailing a missing person case from the neighboring town. Scribbled on the edge was a note in Joe's handwriting: "Curiosity has consequences." I threw the clipping away, but the message was clear. He was watching me, and he knew he'd gotten away with it. I don't know what to do now, trapped in this silent battle, terrified of what he might do if I ever try to expose him. I never considered myself a strong person. In fact, I often felt like I was floating through life, always just on the periphery of everything, never really engaged. But that changed one night when I decided to take a hiking trip in the local woods, a place I'd grown up near but never truly explored. I thought it might be a fun escape from my monotonous routine. The woods were dense, ancient trees twisting together in a way that felt like a living labyrinth, whispering secrets I wasn't privy to. The sun was setting, painting the sky in hues of orange and purple, and I decided to push further onto a path that felt too enchanting to abandon. After an hour of wandering, I stumbled upon an old cabin, its wooden walls weathered and covered in moss, as if it had been swallowed by the forest. Something about it pulled me in, a mix of curiosity and foolish bravery compelling me to explore its dark interior. I stepped inside, the air thick with dust and the scent of decaying wood. The silence was oppressive, broken only by the creak of the floorboards beneath my feet. As I stepped deeper into the cabin, I noticed strange carvings on the walls, symbols and hieroglyphs that seemed to shift in the dim light. Suddenly, I heard a noise, a rustle coming from the far corner of the room. Panic surged as I turned, half expecting to see a wild animal or a lost hiker, but what I saw chilled me to the bone. A figure, tall and shadowy, emerged from the darkness. Its features were indistinct, cloaked in shadows. Fear gripped my heart, but instead of running, I felt an inexplicable urge to confront whatever this was. "Who are you?" I stammered, my voice echoing in the stillness. The figure raised its hand, pointing to the symbols on the wall. Then, to my shock, it spoke, though its voice was a mere whisper that felt both distant and near. "You seek strength, yet you are lost. To find it, you must face your fears." Just then, the ground shook, and the cabin lurched around me. The shadows deepened. I was suddenly standing at the edge of a vast abyss, the cabin nowhere to be seen. I felt a crushing weight of isolation. My heart raced. I had to decide, would I jump into the unknown, or turn back, spiral again into the safety of ignorance? It was the first challenge. The silence around me was deafening, each moment stretching into infinity. I thought about my life, the self-doubt, the loneliness, the constant feeling of insignificance, and I realized that jumping into the void represented my deepest fears, my failures, the myriad reasons I felt weak. My heart pounded in my chest, but something else burned within me too, an ember of determination. I took a step toward the edge of the abyss, and my breath hitched in my throat. I edged closer, the unknown calling to me in a way I never anticipated. In that moment, I leapt, feeling the rush of air around me as I fell. But instead of plummeting into darkness, I began to rise. As I ascended, the air filled with colors, vivid reds and blues and greens, transforming the abyss into a breathtaking expanse of light. I was no longer afraid. I realized that embracing challenges head-on was my strength. I found myself soaring through this kaleidoscope, feeling freer than ever before. But the journey didn't stop there. I was set upon new trials, each infused with lessons that rang true. In one, I faced a storm, the skies turned dark, and winds howled. I stood my ground, feeling the power of resilience surge within me as I embraced the chaos. In another, I encountered a raging river, swift and treacherous, blocking my way. I had to find the courage to swim against the current, a task that left me breathless and exhausted, but I emerged victorious on the other side, every stroke strengthening my resolve. With each challenge conquered, I felt pieces of myself coming together, fitting into place like a puzzle I never knew existed. I realized that my strength wasn't in physical prowess but in my ability to confront fear, to embrace discomfort, and to push through obstacles. After what felt like a lifetime of trials, a final challenge awaited me, a mirror reflecting my deepest self. In its depths, I saw my insecurities, my failures, but also my potential, my growth, and all the battles I had fought. It was both haunting and liberating. As I gazed into the mirror, I understood that every hardship, every moment of doubt, had forged my identity, crafting a strength I would carry with me. In that instant, the shadowy figure returned, a faint smile on its featureless face. "You've learned well," it whispered. With those words, the mirror shattered, and I felt myself being pulled back into the woods. The cabin had vanished, leaving me standing alone among the trees as dawn broke, casting light through the leaves. My heart raced with the aftershocks of my journey. What had felt like an ordinary hike had transformed into a rite of passage. In conquering the unknown, I had awakened a strength I never knew existed, and the world around me seemed brighter, more vivid than ever before. I walked back, but now each step was a reminder of the empowerment I found in the face of fear. The ancient woods, with all their shadows and secrets, had led me to the most significant realization of my life, that strength isn't a physical attribute but a mental surge, a determination to rise through challenges. I left the woods that day forever changed, transformed by an experience rooted in both terror and triumph. I entered that cabin a lost soul, but I emerged with clarity, a tangible recognition of my potential. It's easy to dismiss fears as weaknesses, to retreat into our shells, but I now know that each challenge brings us closer to who we are meant to be. So, if you ever find yourself in the woods, lurking near shadows and echoes, remember, it is through the trials we face that we discover our true strengths. The journey is yours to take, embrace it, and you may find yourself soaring beyond your wildest dreams. I often took long walks to clear my mind, a habit that helped combat the weight of an exhausting job and the gloomy thoughts that often clouded my days. One evening, I set out on my familiar route, a winding path through a nearby wooded area, where tall trees loomed overhead, their leaves whispering secrets as the wind rustled through. The sun was dipping below the horizon, casting the world in hues of orange and purple, and I breathed in the crisp air, letting it fill my lungs. With each step, I felt the burdens of the day slowly lifting, replaced by the calmness the evening brought. I walked deeper into the woods, letting the trail lead me where it wanted. You know those moments when the world seems to hang on the edge of something profound? That's what I felt, a stirring in my gut, like anticipation of something monumental. I rounded a bend, and there it was, a clearing I had never noticed before. It was framed by trees that stood guard around a massive boulder, old and weathered, its surface carved with strange symbols that looked almost like letters from a language I couldn't recognize. Intrigued, I stepped closer, curiosity piquing as I traced my fingers over the markings. Something about it felt eerily familiar, yet entirely foreign. Then, without warning, I heard a whisper, a soft, melodic sound that seemed to echo from the stone itself. I jerked back, heart racing, scanning the area for others, but I was alone. The whisper beckoned me closer, as if it were calling me to listen, to understand. I shook off the dread that washed over me, convincing myself it was just my imagination, a trick of the mind. But something within was drawn to that sound, and I took a deep breath, kneeling down to press my ear against the cool rock. The moment I did, the whispers grew louder, coalescing into coherent words, echoing in my mind. It was a warning. Remember who you are. Those words hung in the air like the last note of a haunting song, reverberating long after the sound had faded. Confused, I pulled back, glancing around as if someone might have slipped into the clearing when I wasn't looking. I was rattled, yet an undeniable urge to stay and listen to more overwhelmed me. What did it mean? The thoughts spiraled in my head, heavy and precarious, and I felt a sudden chill creep up my spine. It was as if the very ground beneath me trembled with an ancient energy, and I couldn't shake the feeling that this place held secrets, secrets that stretched beyond time. I stood up, looking down at the boulder once more, feeling a compulsion bubbling within me to engage, to unravel whatever mystery lay hidden. Then I noticed something else. Shadows moved awkwardly around the perimeter of the clearing. I squinted into the encroaching twilight, trying to discern what was casting them. To my horror, they began to coalesce into shapes, human shapes, distorted and melding with the trees, their eyes glowing with an unnatural light. They termed themselves the Watchers. Their whispers began to blend into a singular voice, a chorus of the lost and the damned. You answered our call, the voice reverberated, echoing through the clearing. My heart raced, I felt rooted in place, terror gripping my limbs and rendering me motionless. You will remember. I shook my head, the sound of their voices bouncing around my skull, desperate to drown it out. Panic engulfed me as the shadows loomed closer, their forms becoming grotesque as if they were drawing energy from the very air. I stepped back, ready to flee, but my feet refused to move. You must understand, they cried in unison, this is your chosen path. Then, it clicked. Flashes of memories that weren't mine cascaded through my mind, images of endless walks through desolate forests, of whispers echoing in the dark, of faces drifting in and out of existence. My head spun as I attempted to reclaim my reality. No. This isn't happening, I shouted at them, feeling the raw power of their energy crash around me, relentless and consuming. You're nothing but shadows. One stepped forward, its eyes locking onto mine with an intensity that burned. We are history, we are fate, we are you. You must choose to remember. In that instant, a heavy surge of realization washed over me. I was one of them, a watcher trapped in a cycle, burdened by a truth I had refused to accept. Every long walk I took was not merely a retreat from reality, it was a ritual, an offering to the shadowed corners of my own mind, a call meant to draw me back to my origins. The weight of my choices settled within my chest like a leaden anchor. The whispers grew frantic, urging me to embrace this knowledge, to remember the past I had forsaken. I gasped as memories flooded back, lives lived in the shadows, half-forgotten dreams, and warnings unheeded. Then came clarity like the dawn breaking, and I understood that the long walks hadn't merely cleared my mind, they were attempts to escape the truth, a futile endeavor that led me back to this moment, to this clearing. You are not lost, the shadows spoke softly now, coaxing me. You are home. With that, I found my voice amidst the chaos. What do I do? I asked, feeling the power shift, the shadows pulsing with anticipation. Accept your fate, they whispered. I took a deep breath, my heart steadying as I acknowledged the weight of the history I carried. I could feel the threads of time pulling taut around me, a tapestry woven with my past lives. It was overwhelming, yet liberating. The shadows laughed softly, their faces softening, merging into a single lightness. Now you remember, they said, and in that moment, the clearing glowed, casting away my fears and uncertainties. As the last remnants of twilight faded, I found myself standing alone, the whispers receding into the depths of the woods. I had come seeking clarity, and I had found it, though it came at a cost. With every step away from the boulder, I felt the distance dissolve between my present and the echoing whispers of my past, knowing now that sometimes, we must walk through the darkness to find the light. It was a power I would carry forward, a revelation born from the shadows, a reminder that I was never truly alone on my journey through life. And as I stepped off the path and onto the street that led me home, I couldn't help but smile, an eerie yet exhilarated anticipation thrumming beneath my skin. I knew I would return to the woods, to the boulder, to the shadows, not as a seeker, but as one of them, a true watcher in the tapestry of time. I've always considered myself a supportive friend, but I never anticipated that a single night could change everything. It started innocently enough, a text from Jake, asking if I was up for a late-night chat. We'd been friends since our freshman year of college, bonding over shared interests in horror movies and the occasional gaming marathon. I could tell by the way he phrased it that something was off. Jake never initiated these late-night talks, always preferring to stick to lighter topics. I agreed, thinking I could help him sift through whatever was bothering him. We set a time, and I made some popcorn, partially excited and partially anxious because Jake had always been the more stable one in our friendship, like the lighthouse guiding me through my turbulent seas. When Jake arrived, his usual bright smile was replaced by an expression that made my stomach churn. He looked like he hadn't slept in days. I offered him some popcorn and realized he was trembling slightly, his fingertips barely grazing the bowl as if he were scared to touch it. "You good?" I asked, trying to break the tension. He didn't respond immediately, just stared at the popcorn as if it were the answer to some unsolvable equation. Then he sighed and launched into a story that sent chills crawling up my spine. He spoke about a darkness that had been creeping into his life, an overwhelming, suffocating weight pressing down on him. I listened intently as he detailed how he'd been having vivid nightmares that felt all too real. At first, it started with his ex-girlfriend, Bella, who had mysteriously vanished months prior. They'd lived together for nearly 2 years, and her disappearance had loomed over him like a dark cloud. Jake watched while the police searched her last known location without any luck and with a growing sense of helplessness. He described how the dreams had started simple but quickly morphed into something more sinister. In his dreams, Bella would call out to him from a place shrouded in mist, her voice becoming increasingly desperate. The more he tried to reach her, the more she slipped away, like grains of sand through his fingers. Last week, he confessed he hadn't slept much at all, consumed by relentless worry that he was somehow to blame for her disappearance. "It's as if she's trying to tell me something," he said, his voice trembling as he described one particularly horrifying dream where her eyes, usual sparkling blue, were now hollow and filled with darkness. Each time he awoke, he felt a lingering ghostly presence as if Bella was somehow still tied to him, and he hadn't done enough to solve the puzzle of her absence. My instinct was to point out that dreams don't dictate reality, but there was an unsettling weight to his words. Instead, I told him that it was natural to feel haunted after losing someone close, and that he should talk to a professional. He dismissed the idea with a wave of his hand, but not before revealing something shocking. He had an eerie feeling that Bella was still somewhere in the world, calling out for him, and that he was running out of time to find her. As the conversation spiraled into the early hours of the morning, I felt a deep urge to help him navigate this labyrinth of whirlwinds. After all, friends are there to ground each other, right? So, I did what felt intuitive. I suggested we go visit a psychic I had heard about from a mutual friend. Jake's eyes widened at the thought, and for a moment, I feared I'd upset him more. But he nodded, hungry for any glimmer of hope in what felt like an endless darkness. I promptly called for an appointment, and 2 nights later, we found ourselves sitting in a dimly lit room filled with the scent of burning sage and an eclectic mix of trinkets, everything from tarot cards to crystal balls adorning the space. The psychic, an older woman with silver hair and piercing green eyes, greeted us with a knowing smile. She motioned for us to sit, and as we settled into our chairs, I felt a shiver run up my spine. I remained quiet, the skeptical half of me crossed with concern for Jake and the curious half whispering that there might be something more to this than mere charlatanry. The psychic wasted no time, her demeanor shifting as she tuned into Jake's energy. She began to murmur in hushed tones, sensing a disturbance surrounding him, a swirling mix of grief and confusion. Jake seemed captivated, hanging off her every word. Then, she leaned in and whispered something that struck me to my core. "She wants you to look closer. There's something hidden beneath the surface." I hoped I imagined the way Jake's face blanched. He looked like he was about to topple into a dark abyss of fear. After the session, Jake was more agitated than ever, his hands shaking uncontrollably. We left the psychic's lair, with him entangled in thoughts that were spiraling like a tornado. "I think I need to go back to that spot where she disappeared," he said in a low voice, eyes clouded with a mixture of determination and dread. Before I could protest, he was already halfway to his car. I didn't want him going alone, but it felt crucial that I remain supportive. We drove to the abandoned location where they used to meet after work. It was late at night, the perfect backdrop for questions better left unasked. The landscape was eerily calm, moonlight spilling across vacant fields that felt otherworldly. With a mix of fear and resignation, I stepped out and followed Jake as we walked toward the last place he had seen her. The air grew thick with tension. I felt as if the world around us held its breath. When we reached the spot, Jake dropped to his knees. I stood there, frozen in place, watching him and sensing every muscle in my body tense. I had hoped that he'd find closure, but what followed shattered that hope. Jake started talking to the darkness as if it could hear him, pleading for answers that lingered just out of reach. I wanted to scream something, anything, but the words lodged in my throat. Just as I was about to step closer, I felt it, a chill slithered along my neck, and the air seemed to thrum alive with energy. Jake's breath quickened, and suddenly, it felt as though the air around us crackled. The mist rolled in from nowhere, thick and heavy, and I could barely make out Jake's form in front of me. He continued calling Bella's name, and then the atmosphere shifted, shadows twisted and turned around him, chaotic forms converging into a singular entity. A whisper tickled my ear, a low, desperate sound that sent icy nausea coiling in my gut. In that instant, I recognized the voice. It was Jake's own voice, distorted, as if it were coming from somewhere deep within the infinite void. "Help me." The tone sent a ripple through my heart, a weight of responsibility that felt insurmountable. I lunged forward to grab Jake, but just as my fingers grazed his shoulder, the shadows constricted around him, ensnaring him in their grip. Fear paralyzed me as I watched Jake wrestle, tossing his head back as if the spirits of the lost were dragging him down into their dark realms. "Get out!" he screamed, a visceral cry that shattered the stillness of the night. The panic surged through me, and I yanked him, pulling with all my might. In that moment, I wasn't just helping a friend, I was fighting with every fiber of my being against whatever dark influence had taken hold of him. Finally, with one last, desperate effort, I broke through the chaotic void. Jake collapsed to the ground, gasping for air. I knelt beside him, feeling the warmth radiate from him as he shuddered, the shadows receding like a tide pulled by the moon. We just sat there for what felt like eternity. He was confused, chest heaving, and I was left grappling with the terrifying truth of what we'd almost lost that night. I had been there to help him find closure, but what I found instead was a dark labyrinth that shadowed every corner of our friendship. Over time, we processed it together. Jake worked through therapy, while I stood by, nurturing him like a fragile flower. Eventually, he began to heal, to let go of the haunting past, but the true journey was discovering how we still had each other's backs, even when the shadows crept too close. Today, we still talk about that terrible night, and while it remains an indelible part of our story, I can finally understand that even in the darkest moments, we can help guide each other back into the light. I never thought I could be that person, the one who projects calm confidence and strides boldly into every situation. The truth? I was terrified of failure. As a kid, every missed opportunity haunted me, every no I heard echoed in my mind like a relentless ghost. In college, the very thought of giving presentations made my palms sweat, and I would always pull out of auditions for roles I wanted, leaving me wondering what could have been. My fear became my prison, cloaked in shadows, trapping me in a shell of self-doubt. But everything changed one fateful night when I stumbled upon an old theater haunted by its past glory. It was at least a century old, built when people came together to escape their lives, and now it stood silently. I could almost hear the whispers of performances that had captivated audiences long ago, and I felt drawn inside. It's strange how a building can impose its presence upon you, but the moment I crossed the threshold, I felt an eerie chill. The air was thick with the scent of dust and faded dreams. As I explored, I discovered an old, rusty stage adorned with tattered velvet curtains that clung to the sides like a wounded animal. Something compelled me to step onto that stage, and as I did, the fear that coursed through my veins began to mix with a strange sense of purpose. I closed my eyes, and in my mind, I transformed into an actor under the bright, scintillating lights, drowning every whispered no in a sea of imaginary applause. I didn't realize how long I'd been standing there until a creak from the wings startled me back to the present. It was just an old sound, a slice of nostalgia. But something about it screamed life. I hesitated, but I needed to leave my fears behind. As I turned to go, a shimmering shadow flickered at the corner of my eye, just behind the curtain. My heart raced, and a primal instinct urged me to flee, but instead, I took a step closer. Curiosity won over fear. I tugged the curtain aside and was greeted by a dimly lit room adorned with photographs of past actors, each captured in a moment of triumph. Everything about that room felt alive, a testament to every risk taken, every dream pursued. I wanted that. I needed it. So I made a decision right then, standing in that chilled embrace of forgotten artistry. I would conquer my fear, no matter the cost. I returned to the theater every night that week, rehearsing monologues, delivering them to myself in the dim light. I decided to write my own script, pouring my insecurities and hopes into words. Each performance by myself felt like a slice of freedom, erasing the lines that had been drawn around my capability. I was turning my fear into fire, and each day it burned brighter. I became consumed by my vision. Soon, the nights when I stood on stage transformed me. When the weekend rolled around, I entered a local story competition at the university that advertised a performance of original works. I felt a wave of déjà vu wash over me, like a ghost, urging me to step forward. The deadline loomed near, and I finished my screenplay, a darkly comedic take on my journey, intertwined with the ghosts of failure. I would share my story with everyone, leaving my vulnerability in full view for the first time. I could envision myself trembling on that stage, but I knew I had to take that leap. Opening my heart to the world felt like standing on the edge of a cliff, teetering on the brink, but for the first time, the thrill of possibility surpassed the weight of dread. The day arrived, and my heart was pounding in rhythm with the drum of anticipation. I could feel the electric energy of the theater pulsing around me. As I walked to the center stage, I glimpsed the faces watching me, each one a reflection of my fear and my hopes. But as I spoke the first words of my piece, magic unfolded. The words poured from me like rain, refreshing and liberating, and with each laugh and gasp from the audience, I felt a piece of my fear shatter. In those moments, standing before them, I transcended the friction of my past. It was exhilarating and terrifying, but I had become the puppet master of my own narrative. When I finished, applause erupted like fireworks, echoing through the dim theater, and for a split second, I stood in disbelief. I had done it, I had confronted my fear and emerged victorious. After that, something strange happened. I felt the theater hadn't just witnessed my moment, it had absorbed my struggle, my triumph. The ghost of failure had changed. It had transformed from a dark presence stalking my steps to a soft whisper that urged me onward. I learned fear doesn't vanish, it's just a shadow we can learn to dance with instead of running from. Months passed, and the theater became a sanctuary for me. I volunteered to help other burgeoning artists showcase their talents, becoming part of a supportive community that celebrated each victory, no matter how small. I even began to lead workshops, guiding others through their fears, helping them find their voice and their confidence. One evening, as I was rearranging chairs before a show, I noticed a new shadow flitting through the wings. At first, I was apprehensive, but then I felt an understanding bloom within me. A young woman hovered in the doorway, I could see the same fear etched onto her face that had once mirrored my own. She reminded me of my first night in that theater when the air was thick with uncertainty. I approached her, inviting her inside. I welcomed her into the space, knowing the dark whispers would eventually unveil the glowing possibilities nested within. There I was, an echo of my former self, standing as a beacon. The theater was alive. It was more than just wooden floors and velvet curtains, it had become a vessel for stories, fears, and dreams. The ghost of failure that once haunted me now served as my guiding light, reminding me that there's nothing wrong with being afraid. So I transformed my fear into the embers of possibility. And in that journey, I found strength, not just for myself, but to uplift those who feared they'd never take center stage. Looking back, I realized that we all possess the ability to transform our shadows into shimmering lights. Often, we just need the right stage to tell our stories and the courage to take that first step. I can't believe I'm posting this, but I feel like I have to share. The past few months have been a whirlwind, and what started as a simple break from life ended up revealing things that weren't meant to be uncovered. It all began when I found myself overwhelmed by the everyday grind. I was weighed down by work, relationships, and expectations. So, I did what anyone would do when they hit rock bottom. I booked a cabin in the woods for a weekend getaway. The cabin was rustic, isolated, and nestled deep within a forest that seemed to have been untouched for centuries. I arrived late in the afternoon, sunlight trickling through the leaves, casting dancing shadows on the ground. The air was crisp and filled with the sweet scent of pine, and for the first time in months, I felt a flutter of hope. I unpacked my bags, set up a fire pit, and settled in for what I thought would be a peaceful, rejuvenating weekend. But as night fell, the atmosphere shifted. The once comforting sounds of nature transformed into something more sinister. The rustling of leaves became whispers, and each snap of a twig felt like an omen. I tried to shake off the unease as I sat by the fire, staring into the flames. My mind was racing with thoughts, and maybe I overreacted by isolating myself. But deep down, I felt that this trip would lead to something profound. I just had to weather a few odd occurrences. The first night passed in peculiar calm, but I woke in the middle of the night, drawn to a strange sound outside. It felt like a low hum, almost melodic, calling me into the woods. I pulled on my jacket, grabbed a flashlight, and stepped outside to follow the music. The deeper I went into the forest, the louder the sound became, almost enveloping me. I noticed a faint glow ahead, like moonlight illuminating something extraordinary. As I approached, I stumbled upon a group of what looked like old stones arranged in a circle, and in the center sat a shimmering figure, its translucent form flickering like the flames of my campfire. It was beautiful, and terrifying, with features too vague to describe but enchanting enough to keep me transfixed. The music resonated from it, a hauntingly beautiful tune that struck a chord deep within me. I thought about turning back, but something beckoned me forward, an instinct to understand what I was witnessing. In that moment, the figure looked up and met my gaze. It felt like 1,000 memories crashing into my mind. I was bombarded with images from my life, my childhood, lost friendships, missed opportunities, and things I thought I had forgotten. And then came the clarity, a sudden insight into my life choices and the reasons behind my dissatisfaction. It revealed how I had buried my creativity under the weight of societal expectations, how I conformed to the mold laid out for me without ever questioning whether it fit. I began to sob, overwhelmed by a tide of self-realization, but the figure lifted its hand, silencing my anguish. In a gentle, knowing motion, it began to shift the music, weaving it into a different melody, a hopeful one, full of possibility. It told me that clarity doesn't always bring comfort. Sometimes, it's a painful reminder of what we've sacrificed on the altar of normalcy. But within it lies a choice, a chance to redefine everything. As the night wore on, I was entranced by the figure's dance, as if it was guiding me through my past, my regrets, and my dreams. Hours felt like minutes. I knew the sun would rise soon, and I was clinging to the knowledge that I had tried to retreat from my life only to be shown what I truly wanted. When the first rays of dawn touched the treetops, the figure began to fade, and the moment slipped through my fingers like sand. I stumbled back to the cabin, shaken but filled with an electric energy. As the sun arched into the sky, I sat on the steps of the cabin, heart pounding, replaying every detail in my mind. I spent the rest of the day contemplating what I had learned. It wasn't just a mystical experience, it was a prompt to act. I had taken a break, yes, but more importantly, I had found the clarity I needed to reshape my life. That day, I made choices instead of succumbing to the routine. I picked up an old sketchbook and began to fill it, letting my imagination run wild. I reached out to friends I lost touch with, apologized for the silence, and made plans to meet. I enrolled in a pottery class, something I had always wanted to try. But something else lingered on the edges of my mind, a sense of responsibility. I had learned this gift for clarity came at a cost. As I returned to my everyday life, I couldn't shake the feeling that the figure I saw wasn't just a figment of my imagination. I had a sense that it was still out there, watching over me. I kept my eyes open for the extraordinary even as the days faded into a blur of routine again. Then came a dark twist. Within a week, I noticed subtle signs of something wrong. Friends would approach me, eyes wide with a terror I couldn't explain. Odd, mundane accidents began happening, lights flickered more frequently, whispers echoed in rooms I was alone in. At first, I brushed them off, thinking I was imagining things. But then I started hearing the music again, our little forest hymn, playing soft and sweet in the dead of night. It was as if that ghostly figure was calling me back, but for what purpose? Was it a warning, or a beckoning to remember the lessons I'd learned? My nights became filled with restless sleep and cold sweats, realizing I had opened a door to something I couldn't quite grasp. I dove deep into research, scouring the internet for folklore, local legends, trying to connect the dots. I learned that ancient spirits are known to carry messages to those in need, and that some people are graced in that way. But there was no hero's tale for those who ignored the signs. It warned that to take is to also give, and as I scrolled through warnings, I felt a weight in my chest. I worried I had taken too much. Then, one night while working late, I received a notification from a local news site. A family had gone missing just a few miles from my cabin, vanishing without a trace. My heart raced, and those whispers returned. What if the figure I encountered had led me to clarity but demanded balance in return? I began writing everything down, not just my experiences but a testament to anyone else seeking the peace of the woods. I shared it on forums, talked to friends, warned them there might be something else out there, lurking just past the veil of clarity. I still feel it watching sometimes. I can hear the hum when loneliness sets in. But I no longer fear it. I honor that experience and stay vigilant. I took a break and found clarity for sure, but I know now that any shift from the mundane carries risks. Whether it's balance or warnings, I don't know. All I can say is, if you seek clarity in the woods, be cautious. You might just find something that reshapes you, or worse, something that demands a price. So here I am, sharing this, hoping someone will read it and heed the warnings. There's magic out there, but it's accompanied by shadows, and not all of them are benevolent. Don't let the song of the woods enchant you without remembering to keep your own voice in the melody.
I'm a snuff film superstar, but I'm starting to worry about the attention I'm getting, and it all began with a simple video that I filmed on a dare to impress some friends, the laughter echoing in the dimly lit basement, the sound of the camera whirring to life as I sat on the edge of my seat like a coiled spring, ready to perform for their amusement, not knowing this fleeting moment would spiral into something beyond my control. The so-called challenge consisted of me confronting an old, dusty mannequin I had found at a thrift shop. Someone dared me to act as if it were an unsuspecting victim, pretending to strangle it while they filmed my over-the-top theatrics, the entire scene steeped in dark humor. I never thought it would end up on the dark corners of the internet, morphing into something grotesque. A week later, my phone buzzed incessantly, notifications flooding my screen, and my friends told me it was going viral, but I couldn't understand why because I had only been joking around, though I watched it and felt that unsettling knot in my stomach when the comments turned from playful jokes to sinister praise. People were enamored with my performance, laying claims that my comedic take was too realistic, and amidst all this attention, I started receiving messages from obscure accounts asking if I could do it for real. At first, I dismissed the inquiries as a twisted prank, but a part of me ignited with that dangerous thrill of being desired, wanted for something darker, something that felt intoxicating yet horrifying. Weeks went on, the followers surged as I leapt down this rabbit hole of dangerous fantasies, and to satisfy my craving for attention and thrill, I began filming more elaborate skits. I remained carefully balanced on a tightrope stitched with deception, but as the views skyrocketed, so did the chilling requests, and what I previously thought were harmless jokes morphed into demands for authenticity that gnawed at my sanity. Night after night, I'd receive notes slipped under my door, cryptic scrawls beckoning me closer to the edge, urging me to cross that moral line. They wanted me to capture real fear, real pain, echoing through my mind while I struggled to breathe, suffocating on the weight of their desires. I ignored the pleas for weeks, but the sound of my phone ringing had transformed from a simple notification to a grim reminder of my growing infamy, and then the DM from the account symbolizing the darkness I was already swimming in appeared, a chilling message adorning my screen that read, "We know where you live. We want you to show us how real it can be." And it hit me then that my life was no longer mine, but an alluring stage for those hungry wolves craving content spun from suffering, my initial thrill turning to gut-wrenching dread as I scrolled through more videos on forums taunting my name, websites where fans crafted narratives surrounding my supposed creativity. Soon, they spun their own theories about my character, speculating that I might even be involved in underground rings, and I felt like glass, fragile, teetering on a precipice. All it would take was one crooked push, and I would shatter completely. I disconnected my social media, blocked countless accounts threatening to expose me while I paced beneath the dim hum of my overhead light, a hermit wrapped in fear, but the darkness began creeping into my dreams, leaving me breathless as I witnessed my own demise play out in a surreal tableau where I was both the actor and the victim, their whispers slithering in my ear, drowning me in dread, and I jolted awake, drenched in sweat, realizing that running wouldn't save me, and this was far from over. One day, a knock on my door shattered the silence, and my heart raced as the gravity of that single sound echoed in my chest. There stood a figure draped in shadow, words strung across their lips that froze me in place. "We're here to give you a job upgrade," they said, their voice a raspy whisper that left a chill snaking down my spine. Desperation clawed at my heart, but morbid curiosity anchored my feet. I'd been waiting for someone to offer me the chance to take my performance to the next level, but deep down, I knew their invitation was woven with darkness. They wanted to turn me from a mere performer into a puppet snipped at every string until only the horror remained. I took a step back, trembling as visions of my so-called fans danced through my mind like fireflies, illuminating the horror encasing me, and I closed the door, heart thundering, praying it would be over, but the weight of their words, that promise of invincibility, bred a hunger I couldn't extinguish. Days turned into dusk, and soon I found myself staring at the screen, mind racing, justifying all the decisions that spiraled out from one stupid dare. How easy it had been to flirt with the dark side, but now it was stifling me, consuming every piece of happiness, no matter how hard I yearned to sever the ties as their demands morphed into my reality. I began crafting a new narrative, featuring masked figures surrounding me, the line between staged horror and reality increasingly blurred, my heartbeat syncopated with the pulse of the desperate throng scattered across chatrooms that thrived on the morbid, echoing their twisted adulation for pain, and soon enough, I became their addiction, every slip of my mask followed by wild cheers, the world outside dulling into an unrecognizable heap, drowning beneath their awaiting silence. Then, one fateful night, I set up my camera for what I foolishly glamorized as my final act, hoping against hope to check the pulse of the virtual audience that had become my lifeblood. The air captively crackled with an electric tension, and as the sun dipped and shadows invaded my space, I caught the glimpse of something I couldn't ignore, the flicker of movement behind the blinds. My heart dropped, drowning in an icy river of terror, but I continued to capture footage, portraying acting skills honed to grotesque perfection until a static sound halted my breath, a blip through my speakers, followed by a voice dripping with mockery, "Show us your true self," and before I could comprehend how it was possible, my heart lurched as dark figures poured into my home like ink, silencing me before I could scream. They were everywhere, their faces painted with maddened fervor, waiting to teeter that final moment of entertainment, the line between life and loss dissolving under the blaring lights, their cheers overshadowing the truth simmering beneath me. For the first time, I realized that I truly was the protagonist of a horrific snuff film, and this was the script they had been waiting for, the final set piece where I became their greatest performance, a star adrift in chaos, knowing there would be no curtain call, no applause, just the haunting echoes of the desires I'd accidentally unleashed.
I was in a relationship that bled me dry, a toxic cycle I kept telling myself was love. It started innocently. We met at a coffee shop where his charming smile lit up the afternoon like the sun. I was instantly drawn to him, and what began as romantic dates transformed into something darker as his grasp tightened. At first, it was subtle, a comment here, a nag there, masked under an "I'm just concerned about you" facade. But when I look back, I see the signs that were always there, as clear as the moon on a starless night. Over time, his sweet demeanor morphed into ugly accusations, belittling me until I felt like a shadow of my former self. He critiqued my appearance with a twisted sense of concern. "If you really loved me, you'd try to look better for me," he'd say, and I believed him, twisting my self-worth into knots. Friends noticed something was off, but each time they'd express concern, I would brush it aside, burying the voice screaming in my head that told me to leave. A few months in, my world shrank. I was trapped in a small bubble of his making which I painted as a sanctuary, but in reality, it felt like a prison. My friends started to drift away, and I didn't care to reach out. If he was unhappy, I would avoid socializing. I started disappearing. It was a slow fate performed without a cue, but I was so tangled in the webs of his manipulation that I couldn't see the daylight outside. One evening, after an argument that erupted like a firework, I sat on the bathroom floor sobbing, drowning in shame and defeat. I caught a glimpse of myself in the mirror, and for the first time, I didn't recognize the person looking back. I felt robbed of my identity, a puppet pulled by strings I had willingly handed over. I was consumed by despair, but through the fog of my misery, a flicker of resolve ignited. It happened on an ordinary Thursday that soon spiraled into something I never expected. He was late coming home, as usual, and I could feel the anticipation building in my gut. Instead of the warm embrace I hoped for, he stepped inside like a thunderstorm, stirring anger from the depths of a long day. We barely exchanged greetings before he exploded over something trivial. I don't even remember what it was now. But I stood there, heart pounding, and instead of retreating into my usual posture of submission, I saw that glimmer of the girl I used to be, the one who laughed loudly, danced unashamedly, lived fiercely. I took a deep breath, feeling the energy course through me. I wasn't going to run to the other room this time. I spoke, words trembling at first, but they grew solid with each breath I took. "You don't get to treat me like this anymore." My voice felt foreign, almost unrecognizable, but I pressed forward, a surge of power filling the spaces he'd once filled with fear. He stared at me, a mixture of shock and rage flashing across his face. "What did you just say?" He spat. For the first time, I didn't feel the urge to retreat under his scrutinizing gaze. No, I stood my ground, defiantly meeting his eyes. I said, "I won't let you control me any longer. I deserve to be treated with respect." That explosive energy between us was palpable, like a live wire about to snap. He stepped closer. I could sense the storm brewing behind those darkened eyes. My heart raced, but I didn't falter. "If you think I'm going to sit here and take your shit, you're wrong," I hissed, feeling stronger with every word. The silence that followed was deafening. I opened the door to my soul, digging deep into a history of pain, and the memories rushed forth like a dam bursting, late-night tears, old friends who faded into the distance, dreams I sacrificed at the altar of his anger. He bristled, fuming, and I thought momentarily he'd unleash his rage on me, but instead, a flicker of doubt crossed his face. "You're being ridiculous," he finally said, but his tone wavered. I had seen the crack in his armor, and though it was thin, I pressed it further. "No, I'm being honest. This isn't love, and I won't pretend anymore." It was a turning point, an indelible moment engraved in the depths of my being. I could feel the shift, the scales tipping ever so slightly toward my side. His emotional anchor felt weak, and perhaps for the first time, I reveled in the idea that I held power, not in a retaliatory sense, but in the strength of self-awareness. He exploded, verbally lashing out, but each insult slid off me like water off a duck's back. I felt an empowering lightness growing within me, as if the chains that had kept me shackled were beginning to rattle and break. "This is who I am," I continued firmly, "and if you can't accept that, then maybe I shouldn't be here at all." The moment hung between us, heavy with implication, and then he chuckled, a grating sound that belied his disbelief. "You think you can just walk away from me?" he said, venom dripping from his words. But that was just it, wasn't it? I did think I could walk away. "You can't keep me. I belong to myself." My voice rose, emboldened with each proclamation. Panic spread across his expression. I saw fear glisten in his eyes, not for what I would do to him, but what he had lost, the power that had always been his. I turned away, and it felt like breaking a spell. The core of my being ignited with a blaze that clashed with the darkness he tried to instill in me. I walked to the door, the weight of my choice buoying me rather than dragging me down. "You can't leave," he shouted. I paused, leaning against the frame, feeling my heartbeat echoing in my ears. "Watch me." And then I walked out, the sound of my own footsteps reverberating like thunder behind me. I stumbled into the night, breathing in the cool air, high on the adrenaline of liberation. In that moment, I was free. Free from the chains of toxic love. I regained control of my destiny and let the night swallow up the remnants of his shadows. It felt like stepping into a new world, an unfamiliar terrain where I had the power to be me, to reclaim what was lost. I wasn't perfect, there was healing left to do, but I had saved the girl in the mirror that night. And when I look back now, I'm grateful for standing up for myself, for igniting that fierce light within, knowing that toxic love would never claim my spirit again. I had escaped, and in doing so, I had found something worth holding onto, the realization that I would always choose me.